time a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 201 Noble Legion. The city's defense command finally received intelligence from Joffre's headquarters. Previously, Joffre had cut off contact with Paris under the pretext of military secrecy, leaving Gallier only able to learn about the general situation at the front through reconnaissance aircraft. Now, suddenly, intelligence was flooding into the city's defense command like a tidal wave. Gallier was initially puzzled. Even if there were setbacks at the front, Joffre was unlikely to do this. It was practically an admission of defeat to Charles. Soon, Gallier understood. Holding a telegram, he said, "It's General Carnes, the French deputy commander. He believes only we can salvage this defeat." Impossible. Charles shook his head as he looked at the telegram. The Germans have sealed off their lines and made ample preparations. All troops sent to rescue will be trapped inside. This was due to the advantages of trench warfare at this time. The Germans had constructed trench defenses at several key locations and even deployed the newly developed A7V tank, a veritable fortress of firepower. All attacks would crumble before them, no matter how many troops were sent. Gallier remained silent, his face grim as he flipped through the telegram. He agreed with Charles. The Germans had invested considerable effort in this battle, and a hasty rescue would likely result in even greater losses. Major General Tycoon, commander of the 2nd Special Artillery Division, understood this all too well. He was the commander facing the German A7V tanks. When Major General Tycoon received the order to break out, he looked around helplessly. His troops had virtually no chance of escape. On both sides were German-held hills stretching for kilometers, each garrisoned by an unknown number of German soldiers. They had constructed fortifications and set up machine guns, relentlessly firing on anyone approaching the hills or attempting to cross between them. The exit ahead was only a kilometer wide, already sealed off by German artillery fire. Rows of 105mm shells pounded the ground. Attempting to break through would mean certain death. Behind them were German tanks, hidden in the blind spots of the hills, unaffected by the French 75mm guns. Once the French troops broke through, they would immediately be met with relentless tank fire. Major General Tycoon attempted to break out using tanks, but several attempts failed. 7 Saint Chamond tanks and 5 CA-1 Rex were already parked at the exit, utterly vulnerable to the German tanks. Major General Tycoon could only report to Joffre repeatedly via radio, "We cannot break out. Enemy lines and positions are everywhere. They are waiting for us to step into this encirclement. We have nowhere to escape." Ring ring. The phone on Gallieni's desk rang. Being able to connect directly to Gallieni was no ordinary feat. Sure enough, Gallier answered the phone with a surprised look. "Congressman Clermont? What's up? To have Charles rescue Cape Town? But, really? Your son is a colonel in the 1st Special Artillery Division. Okay, I'll do my best." He had barely hung up when the phone rang again. "Congressman Jeremiah? You also have relatives in the Special Artillery Division." "He's in the 2nd Special Artillery Division." "Okay, I'm trying to figure it out." Then another call came in. Gallier simply had Lieutenant Colonel Fernand answer the phone, replying to each call with "trying to figure it out." Trying to figure it out. Gallier raised an eyebrow at Charles. "You know what's going on?" Charles nodded. "Yes, I know." The capitalists and congressmen were extremely short-sighted. Lacking military knowledge, they assumed Joffre's attack would be a sure victory, so they transferred their sons and nephews, originally stationed in rear security positions, to the Special Artillery Division to rack up combat achievements. Little did they know. Officers like that shouldn't have been rescued in the first place. It would have been better if they had died there. However, Charles's heart skipped a beat. If he saved them, these congressmen would owe him a favor, and even convince them that only by placing their children and nephews in Charles's troops could they boost their combat record. Would that mean his power would expand further? However, he quickly dismissed the thought. Charles shook his head. How could he possibly save them in this situation? Suddenly, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand looked at Gallieni with surprise, nodded to him, and whispered through the receiver, It's Wells." A flicker of surprise crossed Gallieni's eyes. He stood up and took the phone. "Mr. Wells, your son is in the 2nd Special Artillery Division?" "Major General Tigeny, God, I understand, I'll do my best." Charles was puzzled. Who was Wells? Who had such influence that Gallieni was so cautious? Suddenly, Charles realized, could it be Wells from the Brest shipyard? Why wouldn't this shipyard tycoon send his son to the army instead of the navy, and now he's surrounded? Gallieni hung up the phone and remained silent for a moment before saying to Charles, "Come with me, Major." He turned and walked towards the lounge. An extra chair had appeared in the lounge. Gallieni nodded, gesturing for Charles to sit down, and said earnestly, "As a soldier, I won't ask you to save this army because of a group of capitalists or aristocratic sons. They're all the same to me, but they're different to you," Charles replied weakly. "I know, General, but given the current situation." Furthermore, Gallieni added, "Joffre intends to strictly order the 1st Air Group to suppress and blockade the artillery of the 2nd Special Artillery Division." "Do you know why?" Charles's eyes widened. "No, he can't do that." "Of course he can," Gallieni replied, "using the 1st Air Group to cover the breakout of over 20,000 men of the 2nd Special Artillery Division, even if it means sacrificing the entire Air Group, would be worthwhile. Besides, this Special Artillery Division has many capitalist relatives, and its commander, Major General Tigeny, is Wells's son." "Do you think they'll object?" Charles fell silent. "That's certainly true. The 1st Air Group is insignificant to capitalists, but the 2nd Special Artillery Division is not. Only you can save them, Charles." Gallieni stared at Charles and slowly nodded. "If you can't, no one can." Then Gallieni added, "Whether it's for tens of thousands of French soldiers, for the 1st Air Group, or for yourself." Charles was silent for a moment, then calmly said, "I can try, but I hope nothing like this will happen again." "What do you mean?" Gallieni's eyes lit up. "You can't transfer my troops," Charles explained. "Chaffee doesn't know how to use them. That would be a waste." "This request isn't unreasonable," Gallieni considered for a moment, then nodded heavily. "I guarantee nothing like this will happen again." The image above shows an A-7V tank, equipped with 1 cannon, 6 Maxim machine guns, and operated by 18 people. Chapter 202. This is part of the plan. Charles didn't let Gallieni off the hook. He continued, "I need them to convene Parliament today and make a decision, or I will refuse to send reinforcements to Cape Town." Gallieni was quite surprised by Charles's words. He assured Gallieni that he intended to argue his case in Parliament and persuade the members to make this decision. He believed that, given that his son and nephew had been saved by Charles, the members would agree to let Charles command the troops he had trained, instead of being sidelined as he was now. However, "Isn't this something for later?" Gallieni looked at Charles expressionlessly. "The Parliament might discuss this for days, but your relief of Cape Town is urgent." Before he could finish speaking, Gallieni understood. He nodded slightly, a look of realization on his face. "Is this part of your battle plan?" "Yes," Charles answered calmly. "I'm angry about the 1st Flying Group being transferred, and I'm using this opportunity to demand a guarantee from the Parliament." Gallieni praised. "Good idea. Only in this way will the Germans think they are dealing with Joffre, not Charles." Then Gallieni added, "Then you'd better hurry, Major. German reinforcements may already be on their way. The longer it drags on, the more dangerous it becomes." Wells, dressed in a suit, was pacing anxiously like a cat on a hot tin roof in his villa. He paced back and forth in the living room, hands behind his back, angrily cursing. He should have died on the battlefield, that bastard. I clearly reserved a position for him in the Navy, a bright future awaited him, yet he insisted on becoming an infantryman. Mrs. Brest was pale with fright, unable to say a word, only sitting on the sofa and sobbing softly. She secretly regretted that if she had known this would happen, she shouldn't have supported Tigeny in sending him to the St. Cyr Military Academy. Wells suddenly stopped and asked, "Tigeny has been in charge of logistics in Paris. When did he become the commander of the 2nd Special Artillery Division?" Mrs. Brest dared not answer, and the butler, mustering his courage, replied in a low voice, "Sir, young Master Tigeny is fascinated by tanks. He heard that Joffre was forming a 2nd Special Artillery Division, so he secretly signed up." Wells was speechless with anger. Looking at the scene, it seemed everyone knew the truth except him. Wells gritted his teeth and snorted coldly, his tone tinged with resentment. "Our family built half a fleet for France, and he's completely captivated by a tiny tank, sir," the butler replied. Young Master Tycoon believes that weapons only have appeal on the battlefield, otherwise, they're just. Wells glared at the butler, who quickly swallowed the rest of his words. It was Tycoon's usual saying, weapons that don't need to go to the battlefield, even if their stats are excellent and they look beautiful, are nothing more than vases displayed in the living room. Real weapons are for use on the battlefield, they only truly shine in the blood and death of the battlefield. Clearly, the French Navy was that vase displayed in the living room, with almost no need for combat, because the powerful British Royal Navy would handle all enemies. This was why Tycoon, despite Wells's objections and even the threat of severing their father-son relationship, insisted on joining the army. Wells was helpless with his only son. He had originally thought the army's rigorous and arduous training would make Tycoon change his mind, but unexpectedly, Tycoon persisted in military school for 7 years. Only then did Wells realize that Tycoon's dream of becoming the second Napoleon wasn't just talk, it might have been his lifelong aspiration. Ring ring ring. The telephone startled Mrs. Brest. She looked up as if jolted awake from a dream, her eyes filled with fear, as if worried about more terrible news. The butler was about to answer it when Wells stopped him. Wells quickly stepped forward and picked up the phone. He knew it was likely Gallieni calling. Sure enough, Gallieri's slightly hoarse voice came through the receiver, unhurried. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Wells, but I believe only Charles can rescue the trapped troops." Wells quickly replied, "Yes, I agree with you, General. We should let Charles take command, but there are 2 problems, sir." "What problems?" "First, command is not in Charles's hands. Joffre is still commanding the troops in Cape Town. That's not a problem. Parliament already established the status of the Paris garrison command. Cutting off contact with the Paris garrison commander was Joffre's own decision, and now he has failed and is helpless in the predicament he created. Command should naturally be transferred to you." Gallieri didn't answer. He continued, "The other problem is, you know the first flying group, it's an aircraft unit trained by Charles himself, including the rocket planes and machine gun planes he invented, but it was transferred by Joffre before the war." "I know about this," Wells replied eagerly. "Command of the flight squadron should rightfully return to Charles." "Don't worry, I'll handle it." "No, sir," Gallieni emphasized. "That's not what I meant. I meant that Charles wants more than just this." "Then what does he want?" Wells asked, puzzled. He wanted to end this conversation quickly and send reinforcements immediately, but Gallieni was taking his time. "He hopes nothing like this will ever happen again," Gallieni replied. "You know, he still has tank units under his command, which he trained himself, and perhaps other units in the future. He doesn't want to spend so much effort training them only to have them transferred away with a single order. He thinks, I'll handle this," Wells interrupted Gallieni. "I'll take care of all this. This request is reasonable. No one has any right to take away his achievements. This will discourage Charles and the others. He has already lost his motivation." "What?" Gallieni sighed softly. "He doesn't want to take command unless the council gives him an explanation, but now is not the time to discuss this. I know reinforcements are urgent," Gallieni replied. "But Charles is, in principle, still a minor. He can still throw tantrums, and we can't do anything about it." Wells was stunned. They really couldn't do anything about Charles. Should they send him to a military court for refusing command? A minor could have 100 reasons to refuse command, and all of them would be perfectly reasonable. Wells replied helplessly, "I will immediately convene Parliament to discuss this and will give Charles a satisfactory answer." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 203, Sil A1. Gallieri put down the microphone with satisfaction and looked at Charles. "They'll be convening the council soon." Charles glared at Gallieri, unconvinced. "Underage? Throwing a tantrum, that's a good excuse," Gallieri replied, glancing at the map. "Besides, you should be thinking more about how to rescue them, not continuing to throw a tantrum just because I saw through you." Charles was speechless. Being underage was a cardinal sin. Any dissatisfaction was automatically labeled throwing a tantrum. Joffre's decision was clearly wrong. Charles pointed to the map and analyzed. If the Germans had known from the beginning that Joffre would make a flanking maneuver, they would have naturally anticipated his plan to break out from the middle. Gallieri said non-committally, "But what could they do? They couldn't commit more troops to this salient. They only had 5 divisions here. We, on the other hand, had 5 divisions concentrated on the Cape Town front, and more were being added. If an army attacked from the rear, even just one, we might be able to break out. This was beyond doubt. All the German defenses were built to the west, leaving them defenseless on the east and easily breached. Charles calmly replied, "If the Germans can construct a counter-defense line in the Cape Town area." Galeri's expression changed. "A counter-defense line? They've surrounded and protected themselves with trenches." "That's my guess," Charles answered. "If it were me, I would do the same. Trenches can ensure self-preservation with a small force. As long as there are enough machine guns, artillery, and ammunition, our army won't be able to break through the center, even if attacked from both sides." Galeri stared at the map for a while before slowly nodding. Before the infiltration, Joffre spent 5 days launching a feint attack on Cape Town. He cleverly thought this would fool the Germans, but the Germans had already guessed his intentions. While he was launching the feint attack, the Germans constructed a counter-defense line in Cape Town. This line is likely not far from Lorca, the location of the 2 special artillery divisions in Joffre's plan. Charles agreed, because this will make the defensive line as short as possible. Lorca takes a straight line behind Cape Town, with a total length of only about 20 kilometers. "Yes," Galeri said worriedly, "if the Germans just send 1 or 2 divisions back from the front, they can turn it into another trap." Joffre's so-called 2-pronged attack is actually a moth-to-flame attack on this trap. As he spoke, Galeri looked up at Charles. "So, which direction do you plan to break out from?" Before he could finish speaking, the telephone rang. The call was from Wells. "General, Parliament will convene in half an hour. I think you should be there to answer questions, otherwise our proposals are likely to be rejected." "Yes, sir, I'll be right there." After hanging up, Galeni said to Charles with a helpless expression, "They think we're not preparing for war." So, Galeni stood up, took an infantry coat from the wall and draped it over his shoulders. His tone relaxed. "This is your responsibility, Major. My battlefield is the House of Representatives. I found that engaging in verbal sparring with those old guys might be a good option, but General, what about here?" Charles looked around. Galeni walked straight to the stairs, replying without turning back. "Call me if there are any problems. I trust you can handle it." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand and the others were awe-stunned. Without Galeni's headquarters, could he still command troops to rescue besieged allies? However, Charles only hesitated for a moment. He spent some time sorting through his thoughts and realized it seemed about right, because he didn't need other troops involved. Then he called the tractor factory and found Colonel Estini. "Prepare for battle," Charles said. "What?" Colonel Estini was taken aback, then straightened up and replied, "Yes, sir, I'll be back at the tank base immediately." "No, you stay at the tractor factory and organize the transport," Charles interrupted him. "I need you to take all the tanks, including fuel, ammunition, and mechanics." Colonel Estini tensed instantly. "Sir, I don't understand. I only have the new tanks. They're not ready for the battlefield yet." "Are the 37mm guns installed?" Charles interrupted Estini. "Of the 10 new tanks used for testing, 4 were equipped with machine guns and the other 6 with the newly produced 37mm guns." "Yes," Colonel Estini replied, "but they're still being tested. We want to know their armor-piercing capabilities. Test them on the battlefield." "That's the standard answer," Charles replied. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before a reply came. "Okay, I understand." The tone was full of helplessness. If the test failed, it would mean they would have to produce prototypes again and test them once more. The tractor factory quickly sprang into action. Under Estini's command, tanks returned one by one to the warehouse, where they would be loaded into wagons and transported by train. Matthew, who had participated in the testing, limped forward and asked, "What's going on, Colonel? Where are you taking them?" Estini said nothing, only shook his head slightly. Matthew instantly understood, his face filled with disbelief. "But the drivers have only just learned how to operate them." Estini hummed in agreement, turning his gaze to the tanks. "We haven't even given them proper names yet." The new tanks were designated A1. Matthew, leaning on his cane, took a step forward and said thoughtfully, "I think it could be called the Charles A1. What do you think?" Estini turned to look at Matthew in surprise, then nodded in reply. "You have a real talent for naming things, Matthew." Charles then made another call to the tank base. "Assemble the troops. There's a combat mission." "Yes, sir." Brownie seemed to have expected this. He asked, "Is it Cape Town?" It wasn't hard to guess, only Charles could solve the Cape Town predicament. "Yes." Charles didn't shy away. There was no need to hide it from Brownie's unit. He emphasized, take all the tanks, and 2 loads of ammunition, then, which unit will cooperate with us? Brownie asked casually. The 1st Tank Brigade was a tank unit. The infantry were all professionally trained in combined arms operations. They couldn't be used for fortification along the way, so infantry support was needed. Unexpectedly, Charles replied, no other units, only us. Brownie's heart skipped a beat. Only us? That meant, only flanking without regard for what lay behind. Interesting. Chapter 204 Unexpected Result. Gallieni stood on the podium in the House of Representatives and delivered a stern speech. Gentlemen, I don't know how to put this into analogy. Your industrial property rights are protected by property laws, but the troops trained in the military are not. Charles trained this force. He used it to achieve victory on the battlefield, yet he was excluded. This will have a very bad influence on the military. Everyone will wonder, having put in so much effort for the troops, will they ultimately be excluded like Charles? Immediately, members of Congress jeered, but this is the military. The military belongs to the state, not to any individual. If Charles trains and then commands, over time, Charles will control the army. We cannot allow that to happen. Trainers and commanders should be separate. The members of Congress made a lot of sense. This was even standard practice in the military. For example, when mid to high-ranking officers are promoted, they are often not kept in their original units but transferred to other units to face new environments and new subordinates. The purpose of this is to prevent commanders from developing their own power base by serving in one unit for too long. However, Gallieni came prepared. He had anticipated the councillor's response and calmly replied, that's not the point, gentlemen. The point is that only he knows how to use the troops trained by Charles. He can use these troops to achieve victory, but in the hands of others, they are utterly defeated. This is wartime. I believe we should concentrate all our forces against the enemy, rather than wasting them like expendable resources. Wells and others immediately stood up in agreement. Gallieni is right. Look at what's happening on the battlefield. Joffre is losing the war because he used Charles's troops. Those troops should remain with Charles until someone learns his tactics. If Joffre wants to utilize those troops, he should at least learn how to use them. I suggest he apprentice under Charles. Laughter erupted in the meeting room. The councillors who supported Joffre looked embarrassed. They couldn't deny the battlefield defeats, yet Charles always seemed to achieve victory. At this moment, Greve stood up and casually asked Gallieni on the podium, General, please allow me to express my doubts. Is now the right time to discuss this matter? Cape Town has over 40,000 troops trapped, and I think we should be discussing how to rescue them. Gallieni thought to himself, here it comes. This was a question he couldn't avoid and found difficult to answer. Greve had placed himself on the moral high ground, while Gallieni and Charles were threatening Parliament with the lives of over 40,000 men. On the train to Cape Town, Charles was discussing battle plans with Brownie and Estini. Our target is roads, Charles said, pointing to the map. The terrain here is flat, suitable for tank breakthroughs. The Germans have deployed 2 artillery battalions there, but they are only 77mm field guns. Charles turned to Brownie and said, you know how to deal with it? Yes, of course. Brownie nodded confidently. Estini's expression was somewhat strange. Sir, we're only breaking through from one flank? That means we have to go the entire distance. Yes, Charles nodded. But the Mark I tank needs its tracks changed after 30 kilometers, Estini reminded him. The entire distance is at least 25 kilometers, which is almost the upper limit. The Mark I might not be able to make it back. 30 kilometers was the result of flat ground testing. The situation on the battlefield would be much more severe, and with combat to consider, completing the entire 25-kilometer distance would be virtually impossible. Charles replied, we won't bring them back, we'll leave them to the Germans. Our goal is to rescue people. Of course, Charles will prioritize rescue, Gallieni answered. The problem is, given the current situation, he can't implement a rescue plan. Greve pressed further, can I know why? Unless that's also a military secret. No, of course not. Gallieni smiled slightly. The situation is critical. Charles believes that to rescue the trapped troops, absolute command is needed, even including the commander-in-chief. Can you do that? A murmur rippled through the meeting room. This implied that even Joffre should be under Charles's command, which was practically impossible. In reality, Gallieni was bluffing. He knew that every minute this pointless discussion dragged on gave Charles more time to prepare. The others were taken aback by Gallery, but Greavy remained composed, asking expressionlessly, "But what does this have to do with today's topic? If it's really as you say, General, we should be discussing command now, but that's not the case. We're discussing Charles's conditions." Armand seized the opportunity to jeer. "Yes, there's only one truth. Charles used this situation. He used the lives of over 40,000 French soldiers as leverage. He wants control of the army. Do you know what controlling the army means? It's the foundation of a dictator." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room. Even Wells couldn't refute it. The right wing's words hit the nail on the head. They were indeed compromising with Charles. After explaining the battle plan, Charles disembarked at the town of Morrick, where Major Laurent's car was already waiting for him. Laurent had brought 2 other cars, one for guards and the other with a radio communications team, as he was worried about potential emergencies at the front. As the car approached Paris, Charles received a telegram informing him that his troops had arrived in Rhodes. Charles nodded and ordered, "Report back, tell the general the troops have arrived safely." In the House of Representatives, Gallieni appeared somewhat flustered and embarrassed under the questioning of the members. Wells and the other members, who had initially thought this was a simple matter, were shocked to find it escalated to the level of a dictator, and fell silent. The room was filled with the arrogant shouts and jeering of the right wing. At this moment, a communications soldier strode into the room and whispered something in Gallieni's ear. Gallieni instantly breathed a sigh of relief, straightened his back, and coldly glanced at Greavy and Armand, his tone full of sarcasm. "Gentlemen, Charles's troops have arrived in Rhodes, and he will begin the rescue operation immediately. I'm very sorry. The reason we did this is because we discovered that some people in Parliament would provide intelligence directly to the Germans, and Charles, from the moment I stood here, his rescue operation began. Now, does anyone still doubt his intentions?" The entire room fell silent instantly. Wells, who had been extremely anxious, breathed a sigh of relief and exchanged glances with the other councillors around him. Greville was stunned. He had thought this was a golden opportunity to bring down Charles, but the outcome was completely unexpected. Chapter 205 Tank Offensive Tactics. At the German Rhodes line, Major General von Basel braved the rain to inspect the firepower deployment, with Colonel Avery, the frontline commander, quickly following behind with several guards. As he walked, Major General Basel frowned and said, "Add a machine gun here, bail out the water here, otherwise no one can run. If you don't want to be blown to bits by enemy fire, spread out your ammunition and hide it well." Clearly, Basel wasn't satisfied with the defenses. But considering this was the 22nd Reserve Infantry Division, expectations couldn't be too high. Reserve units typically consist of soldiers with professional military training but no combat experience. Such soldiers are prone to forgetting everything they've learned due to nervousness upon first entering combat. The reserve unit structure is designed to give them a buffer period. They receive low-intensity combat missions in the reserve, and after adapting to the battlefield environment and gaining sufficient psychological preparation, they are then transferred to regular units. However, due to the widening of the defensive line and a severe shortage of manpower, the reserves were practically non-existent, and they were directly deployed to the battlefield to face the most brutal aspects of war. Even so, they were far better than the recruits who had only learned to fire a gun and line up in a week or two. Basel continued along the trenches, near which lay the bodies of some French soldiers, left behind when the Germans recaptured the positions. Some of them could still move and let out a faint groan. Basel had no time to pay them any attention, leaving them to fend for themselves. The 22nd Reserve Division's mission was simple: hold the line and block all enemy forces attempting to enter the defensive zone, especially enemy tank units. Having traversed half of the defensive line, Basel, deeming it sufficient, turned to Colonel Avery and asked, "How are the 77mm field guns ready?" "Everything is as you commanded, General," Colonel Avery replied briskly. "We've dispersed them within a 200 to 300 meter radius behind the defensive line. They'll only fire when enemy tanks approach." Basel grunted in satisfaction. Field guns, K-round ammunition, plus over 50 T-type anti-tank rifles, facing enemy tanks should be no problem. Just as he was about to end his inspection and return to command post, he suddenly heard someone shout behind him, "Enemy! They're coming up." Basel froze, then abruptly turned and crouched back into the trench along the communication ditch. Ignoring the blood and mud covering the ground, he sprang to his feet, grabbed his binoculars, and cautiously peered out. In the rain, he could indeed see some figures, not many, They were carefully using shell craters and the terrain to advance. A sense of unease crept into Basil's mind. Until now, French attacks had always been either mass infantry charges or overwhelming trench warfare with tanks. This was the first time a small number of infantry had been allowed to advance covertly from 500 meters away. One by one, the soldiers raised their rifles and lay prone in front of the trenches, ready for battle. The previously tense soldiers couldn't help but mock the French's poor appearance. Don't they have tanks? Why are they sending infantry ahead? We've probably wiped out the French already. They should go back and have more children, otherwise, soon France will only have women left. The soldiers laughed heartily, a relaxed atmosphere spreading along the defensive line. Basil ignored them. He knew the soldiers needed an opportunity to joke around and relax. Colonel Avery jogged over and lay down beside Basil, reporting, "General, this might be a French reconnaissance operation." Basil gently shook his head. He sensed that this was not the case. He carefully shifted his gaze, observing the enemy's movements through the aperture of his binoculars. Most of the enemy was operating at a distance of 500 meters, with some climbing to within 200 to 300 meters to approach the trenches. The faint sound of sidecar motorcycles could be heard, but they were invisible from further away. At first, Basil didn't understand what use the sidecar motorcycles were here. Were they planning to use them for a charge? Soon he understood. In his view, rows of barbed wire were easily pulled apart. They're preparing for an attack. Basil frowned. Colonel Avery peeked out questioningly, then replied nonchalantly, "They think they can charge up like this? Our machine guns will teach them a lesson." The barbed wire wasn't the key. As long as there were enough machine guns, no one could get up there. But Basil's expression suddenly changed. "No, they have tanks." Saying this, Basil pointed to several points ahead. "Look at those little red flags." Avery raised his binoculars and looked in the direction Basil indicated. Sure enough, he saw rows of small flags planted in the ground, fluttering in the wind and the rain, like waving little hands. "That's for guiding the tanks," Basil explained. "That way, the tanks can avoid dangerous areas and get to us in the shortest time." Avery's face showed seriousness, and he then relayed the order, "Watch out for enemy tanks, anti-tank rifles ready." Before he finished speaking, a series of booming sounds rang out, shells whistling through the air, growing louder as they approached. But instead of exploding as expected, they emitted thick, acrid smoke, and the German soldiers immediately covered their mouths and noses. Shells rained down, some exploding, others remaining smoke grenades. Soon, the area around the German lines was filled with smoke, moisture, and dust. Combined with the light rain, even at a distance of only 100 meters, only faint shadows could be seen. Basil watched all this with growing unease. He realized that this was likely a complete tank attack tactic developed by the French, with meticulous steps and clear division of labor, and the Germans were completely unaware of and unprepared for such tactics. He and his men knew perfectly well what the French were doing and why, yet they took no countermeasures. The artillery fire grew increasingly intense, with many shells crashing directly into the trenches, sending screams of agony through the German soldiers. Many instinctively ducked into trenches for cover. But Basil sensed the danger. He peeked out and listened intently, and sure enough, he heard the rumble of an engine between shells. Enemy tanks. Basil quickly ducked back down and ran along the trenches, shouting to his men, "The enemy is coming. Organize a defense." However, Basil knew it was too late. The soldiers had no idea what was happening. They had lost their chance to stop the enemy tanks. Chapter 206. This is SEAL style. Mortars suppressed German trenches. Their short range allowed for close coordination with infantry and tanks. Under artillery cover, tanks, carrying infantry, slowly advanced towards the enemy trenches. The tanks were Mark I models. Their 17mm frontal armor was somewhat inadequate, but this wasn't a major problem. A layer of sandbags could be temporarily strapped to the front of the armor before the battle. The barbed wire could also be left unremoved. The Mark I's wide tracks could easily crush or even carry it away. However, Brownie considered one point: the barbed wire could get caught in the tracks and road wheels. Breaking through the lines wouldn't be a problem, but it would require immediate maintenance after the battle. Otherwise it wouldn't be able to travel more than 10 kilometers. Colonel Stini agreed. "We should spend some time removing the barbed wire. This will save more time for subsequent battles." Thus, the scene of engineers hooking away the barbed wire before the battle unfolded. Suddenly, the artillery fire stopped. German soldiers emerged one by one from the trenches, only to find enemy tanks looming before them. The towering tanks resembled giants, their dark machine gun muzzles like eyes, gleaming coldly in the rain, sending chills down their spines. Panicked, the German soldiers attempted to organize a defense, but the machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire. The dense hail of bullets pinned them down, and before they could react, volleys of grenades rained down into the trenches. The French offensive and firepower were relentless, mortars, tanks, grenades, all working in perfect unison, giving the Germans no chance. The Germans lacked not only tactics, but also equipment. The best way to deal with mortars, in principle, is with mortars themselves. But the Germans had no mortars. Similarly, the best way to deal with the grenades was to unleash a barrage of grenades in front of the trenches, but their grenades were still in their rudimentary stage and not yet mass-produced. The result was that the German army was completely overwhelmed by the French army, utterly powerless to retaliate. Under the cover of his men, Basil escaped from a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood. He thought the enemy would expand their gains from the breakthrough point and attack the entire defensive line, but the enemy did not do so. The battlefield fell silent again. Basil, who was on his way out, looked back in confusion. No enemy, no tanks, no grenades. If it weren't for the mess on the battlefield, with German soldiers' corpses everywhere, Basil wouldn't have believed that the enemy had been there. What happened? They came too fast and left too fast. In just over 20 minutes, the enemy broke through the defensive line and left, as if they were just passing by and saying hello to the German army. Colonel Every, who had already fled far away, turned back panting and asked in confusion, They didn't take over the defensive line, they went to reinforce the besieged French army." Basil replied slowly, "They are Charles's troops." Colonel Every's face instantly filled with surprise. Colonel Every had always thought Charles was just a legend. After all, he hadn't experienced it firsthand on the battlefield, and it was likely a figure mythologized by the French. But what happened today forced him to believe it. Because it seemed only Charles's troops could have accomplished such a feat. Berlin, Germany. General Staff Headquarters. Falkenhayn leisurely admired the swirling snow outside the window. He believed that since taking command of the German army, his first major victory was about to arrive, as unstoppable as this snowfall. Falkenhayn was about to deliver a perfect performance, intending to use it to convince Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the Eastern Front faction. The Eastern Front faction believed that victory on the Western Front was impossible in the short term, therefore the main German forces should be transferred to the Eastern Front, and only after victory there should they be redeployed to fully confront the French. "These idiots," Falkenhayn muttered to himself, gazing out at the snow-white landscape. "There are simply no troops to spare on the Western Front. Not only are there no troops, but we need to keep reinforcing them. Otherwise, there would be no Germany, let alone an Eastern Front." At that moment, Colonel Moritz, who was at the radio, suddenly looked up and reported, his voice filled with panic, almost a cry of alarm, "General, Charles's troops have appeared. They've broken through our encirclement." Falkenhayn was startled and abruptly turned to look at Moritz. The people in command were also taken aback, their movements visibly faltering. Falkenhayn rushed back to his desk, his eyes glued to the map, and anxiously asked, "What location? How many troops?" Colonel Moritz, carrying the telegram, strode towards the desk, his voice preceding his arrival. "Road's direction, approximately 2,000 men." Falkenhayn looked up at Moritz in shock, his tone full of disbelief. 2,000 men. 2,000 men broke through the defenses of an infantry division with over 10,000 men. A force of over 10,000 should have been able to hold off an attack by 20,000 or even more enemies, yet it had been breached by 2,000. Colonel Moritz glanced at the telegram again and nodded with certainty. "Yes, General, and it only took 17 minutes. It was Charles's Mark I tanks." Falkenhayn grunted in agreement. This was Charles's style, he shouldn't be surprised. Falkenhayn turned his gaze back to the map, first finding roads, then looking at tram on its extended line, and immediately pointed to the map, ordering, "Immediately send reinforcements to these two places. Charles is very likely to break out from these two locations." "But General," Colonel Moritz reminded him, "the French are concentrating their forces to attack Cape Town. They intend to break out from the front by attacking from both sides." "No," Falkenhayn interrupted Moritz, his tone resolute. "Charles will not break out from the front." Falkenhayn drew a line in the Cape Town area with his finger, explaining, "If Charles's troops infiltrate to Lorca to rescue those two units, and then break out from Cape Town, The total route will be over 30 kilometers, Colonel Moritz said. Oh, Mark I tanks need their tracks changed every 30 kilometers. They can't possibly change tracks in a few hours while breaking out, so they can only take the shortest route. Yes, Falkenhayn pointed heavily to Lorca. Unless he abandons his tanks here, Colonel Moritz added, even if he's willing to abandon the tanks, it won't work. Without tanks, his troops can't break through the Cape Town counterline. Falkenhayn smiled and nodded. Charles is too arrogant. Actually leading only 2,000 men to break through the encirclement in a fantasy of changing the course of the battle. This time, I'll surround him too, but General, Colonel Moritz looked troubled. We don't have any spare troops. Falkenhayn didn't think much of it and immediately ordered, telegraph the 4th Reserve Army and have them send reinforcements to the flanks. Yes, General, Colonel Moritz responded and turned to issue the order. Chapter 207 Riddle. Falkenhayn knew Char well, yet he didn't truly understand Char. He had reviewed every battle Char had fought and knew every piece of equipment Char had invented, especially the Mark I tank. He even boldly analyzed, estimated, and speculated about the tactics Char would develop around tanks in the future. Unfortunately, Falkenhayn once again lagged behind Char's pace. When Char analyzed the battle plan on the train, he emphasized, when breaking through roads, we must use the Mark I tanks. The new tanks must not be exposed. Colonel Brownie and Colonel Estany both nodded in unison, assuming Char was using the new tanks as a secret weapon to catch the Germans off guard on the Samouk Strait. Little did they know, Char's actions had a deeper meaning. The Mark I tanks need to change tracks every 30 kilometers was a fatal flaw. But this flaw could sometimes become a weapon. At the Paris garrison headquarters, Galleri had returned to headquarters, having rid himself of the disgusting congressman. He looked bewildered when he received the intelligence from the reconnaissance plane. We're launching a fierce attack on Cape Town, and 2 encircled units are also making a full-scale breakout towards Cape Town. Why are the Germans shifting their forces from Cape Town to the flanks? And in such a hurry? Charles's gaze remained fixed on the map hanging on the wall, his tone languid as if answering a trivial question. Because of the Mark I tanks. What does that have to do with the Mark I tanks? Galleri looked at Charles with suspicion. Mark I tanks need their tracks replaced every 30 kilometers, Charles replied casually. And then, Galleri asked. He understood as soon as the words left his mouth. The straight line distance between tram and roads was 25 kilometers, which was the distance the Mark I could possibly travel back or break out of the encirclement, at least that's what the Germans thought. Note, in reality, the Mark I could not have returned unless it had consistently traveled by road and encountered no fighting along the way. But the Germans were unaware of this. Therefore, it can be concluded that the Mark I, departing from Rhodes, would have reached the town of Lorca in the central region, rescued 2 trapped units, and then either turned back to Rhodes or continued forward to break out through tram. Choosing any other direction to break out would have been impossible due to the greater distance and the need to change the Mark I's tracks. So, Galleri laughed. You set a trap for the Germans. No, General, Charles replied calmly. I just gave the Germans a riddle. If they're clever enough, they'll guess it correctly, but they'll get a wrong answer. Galleri continued. If the Germans guess the riddle wrong, or don't even realize it, Charles answered, then I'll have to choose between tram and roads to break out, and the result will likely be a failed breakout. Because no matter which one we choose, our flank will be exposed to the 4th Reserve Army of Cape Town. Galleri nodded. Then the 4th Reserve Army might gather 4 divisions to launch a fierce attack on our breakout force. Even if we manage to break out in the end, we'll still suffer heavy casualties. Charles nodded calmly. Galleri chuckled. We're lucky. The Germans aren't stupid, but they're not exactly brilliant either. Just what you're hoping for. He then stared at the map for a moment before asking. I'm a little curious, Major, how do you plan to deal with the German tank forces? I heard the enemy has deployed tanks along the Samouk Strait Road, and that their tanks are designed to counter the Mark I. My tanks have guns too, Charles replied calmly. Besides, my tanks are also designed to counter the Germans, Galleri said and nodded slightly. The young man had considered every possibility. The Samouk Strait Road was named after the town of Samouk. This road was as straight as a flagpole, with hills and highlands stretching for over 10 kilometers on both sides. Although the altitude wasn't high, it formed a canyon-like terrain with only a few exits. The 2nd Special Artillery Division of France was trapped within it. Major General Tigeny, the division commander, was in despair. He discovered that the Germans, with the support of tanks, had already built a defensive line in the rear. The exit at the rear was only 1.5 kilometers wide. The Germans had constructed an arc-shaped trench there, directly facing the depths of the straight road. "Set up the guns," Major General Tigny shouted. "Use artillery fire to support the infantry breakout." However, the Germans were equipped with at least 20 105mm howitzers. The French troops had barely set up their guns when German shells whistled down. In an instant, artillery pieces, artillerymen, and shells were blasted into the air in a flash of fire. Major General Tigny glanced at the high ground on either side and understood. The Germans must have stationed artillery observers there. With just a pair of binoculars, they could accurately calculate the position of the 75mm guns and then use telephones to instruct the 105mm guns to bombard them. A sense of helplessness welled up in Major General Tigny's heart. This was a dead end where breakout was impossible. Why had they so easily stepped into this trap? Because of the road, the Saint-Chamond and CA-1 had to take the road. Furthermore, General Joffre had ordered, "Get to Lorca town as quickly as possible," and this straight road was the shortest route. The Germans had anticipated this, so they had laid a trap and were waiting. "Where are our reinforcements? Where are they?" Major General Tigny asked weakly. "General," the communications officer replied, "they've put Charles in command. Charles's troops have broken through roads, and the reinforcements are behind us." Tigny's eyes lit up. Charles's troops? But then he shook his head slightly and muttered, "Charles's troops are useless. His tanks only have machine guns, they can't possibly be a match for the enemy." Tigny had seen the German tanks through his binoculars. They were practically mobile fortresses, with cannons and dense machine guns. They could potentially penetrate Charles's Mark I tanks from any direction. At that moment, an airplane roared overhead and dropped a bottle. That was how aircraft communicated with ground infantry. Pilots would put intelligence in bottles and drop them to the ground to communicate with the infantry. The sky still belonged to France. This was the only thing that gave Tigny a sense of relief. Soon, the communications officer received intelligence and excitedly reported, "General, Charles's troops will arrive here in 20 minutes. Charles wants us to break out to the north." North? Tigny was puzzled. That was another exit blocked by German artillery fire. Not the direction from which reinforcements were coming. Was this intelligence wrong? Chapter 208 Devil's Paint Job. Around 2:30 p.m., the rain stopped on the Samouk Straight Road. The gray sky began to brighten, and Colonel Matteo thought the weather was clearing up, and the temperature even rose a bit. However, a gust of wind blew, and suddenly, white snowflakes, mixed with raindrops, began to fall. But this didn't bother Colonel Matteo. He closed the hatch and retreated back into the A7V tank, once again enjoying the high temperature and suffocating smoke inside. He envied the infantry. At least they wouldn't die without a breath of fresh air like the tank crew. "Order the troops to find favorable terrain," Matteo ordered the communications officer. "There are at least 30 tanks on the straight road. If the French are pushed too far, they might all rush out." "Yes, Colonel," the messenger responded, immediately leaning out from the top to signal to the surrounding tanks. This was the A7V tank's communication method. Of all the tanks, only the command vehicle, commanded by Colonel Matteo, was equipped with a radio. Soon, 15 A7V tanks lined up in squads on both sides of the straight road, forming a roughly arc-shaped formation with their guns aimed at the exit of the road. As the A7Vs waited quietly for the enemy tanks in the light, almost imperceptible snow, the communications soldier at the flank reported, "Colonel, General Felix has called. Charles's forces have broken through roads and are advancing towards us. They'll reach our position in about an hour and a half. They have at least 30 tanks." "Charles's forces? Mark I tanks?" Colonel Matteo asked, his eyes lighting up. "Yes, Mark I," the communications officer replied. "Frontline personnel have confirmed it, and they haven't seen them equipped with artillery, just machine guns." The soldiers inside the tank cheered, shouting all at once, "We're busy again. Let's have another Mark feast. I love the Mark." "Is this Charles's insistence? He's obsessed with machine guns." Colonel Matteo ignored them. After a moment's thought, he ordered the messenger, "3rd Tank Platoon stays behind, the rest of the tanks withdraw from the battle and follow me. We're going to deal with the Mark I." "Yes, Colonel," the messenger obeyed with flag signals. The 1st and 2nd Tank Platoons soon responded, slowly and laboriously turning around on the rugged terrain, like fat men, and then following behind tank number 501. The tank convoy traveled south along the road for more than 10 minutes before Colonel Matteo ordered the convoy to stop. Inspect, ventilate, prepare for battle. Ventilation was crucial. It wasn't just about the tank crew's breathing, but also about the visibility of the drivers, gunners, and machine gunners. Colonel Matteo wanted the tank units to be in peak condition for battle. Even against the unarmed Mark I tanks came to a stop one after another, hatches swung open, and plumes of thick smoke billowed out, as if they were on fire. The tank crews rushed out, greedily inhaling the fresh air, some coughing. But they paid no heed, waving and shouting excitedly, "Are you sure we're going to take on the Mark I? Of course, I hear there are over 30. I can't wait to defeat the Char, it's so exciting. This is the best news I've heard." The A7V tank was designed from the outset to counter the Char's Mark I. German tank crews received only two types of training: essential operational training and understanding the Mark I's specifications. Everyone, including Colonel Matteo, believed that the Sanchaman and CA-1 tanks weren't really tanks. They could be easily dealt with by infantry and artillery. Anti-tank rifles and 77mm field guns were enough to blow them to smithereens. Only the Mark I, or more precisely, only the Charles tanks, could put up a fight against them. For this reason, tank number 506, the Morphist, even had a devil-carrying paint scheme painted on its gun muzzle, depicting the devil holding a Mark I. The image above shows the devil paint scheme on tank number 506, the Morphist, an A7V tank, holding a Mark I tank. This tank was captured by the Australian Army and is still preserved today. Colonel Matteo didn't get out of the tank. He climbed to the top, opened the hatch, and peered out, carefully observing the other side of the road through binoculars. He was worried that the enemy might suddenly appear in front of him. Putting away the binoculars, Colonel Matteo looked up at the sky. 2 Avro missiles were circling overhead. Would they relay the information that the A7V was waiting for the Mark I? Would they change course because they knew there was a tank waiting ahead? Thinking this, Colonel Matteo loudly ordered the crew to board the tanks, and 10 A7Vs slowly continued forward along the road with a rumble of engines. 2 infantry battalions that had come to support them arrived just in time, the infantrymen gripping their rifles and following closely behind the tanks, sometimes having to jog to keep up. Although the A7V tanks were large, each road wheel was equipped with a balanced coil spring suspension, providing some shock absorption, resulting in excellent stability, comfort, and speed, with a maximum speed of 10 km per hour. 20 minutes later, the troops arrived at the town of Samuk. Colonel Matteo felt relieved. It seemed the enemy hadn't passed through yet. A few hundred meters east of Samuk was a side road, also leading to Tram, but a longer and more circuitous route. Colonel Matteo worried that the enemy might speed through here. However, he thought it unlikely. That road went deep into German-controlled territory, and if the Mark I tanks took that route, they would need to change tracks and obviously wouldn't reach their destination. The tanks continued forward along the road in a long, single file. Matteo checked the time, estimating the enemy wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes or so, enough time for the tanks to seize advantageous terrain. However, several artillery shots rang out, and 3 A7V tanks instantly billowed smoke. One of them, seemingly hid in the fuel tank, soon caught fire, its crew emerging from the flames, waving their hands and screaming in agony. "What happened?" Colonel Matteo asked. Someone replied, "It's Samuk town, Colonel. The enemy is lying in ambush there. Turn to the town, turn to the town." Matteo shouted, "Watch out for enemy artillery, send the infantry up and take them out." "Yes, Colonel," the messenger relayed the order. Colonel Matteo's first thought was, those are enemy infantry guns. The enemy Mark I tanks didn't have cannons. The only weapons capable of firing were infantry guns. This wasn't a major problem. With infantry guns attacking at such close range, a single infantry charge could end the battle. However, as the A7V tank slowly approached the town of Samuk, what Colonel Matteo saw stunned him. Tanks. Tanks Colonel Matteo had never seen before. They were much smaller than the A7V, with a turret equipped with both a machine gun and a small caliber cannon. The 3 A7Vs that had just been destroyed were clearly their doing. Colonel Matteo's heart sank. He realized he might have fallen into a trap set by Charles. Chapter 209. I might not make it in time again today. Chapter 3 will be posted later. Sorry, this was indeed a trap set by Charles. While the German A7V wasn't exactly an excellent tank, it possessed formidable firepower, a 57mm cannon and 6 Maxim machine guns. It might be clumsy, but no one could get close. It was like a mobile fortress, conquering wherever it went, even the Charles A1 tank. The Charles A1 tank had 25mm of frontal armor, but only 13mm of side armor. If the A7V's machine guns were equipped with K rounds, they could potentially penetrate it at a range of 100 meters. Charles had to be careful, especially since the Charles A1 was heavily relied upon. It not only had to win, but win decisively and beautifully. Otherwise, the French army wouldn't be able to cope with the ensuing battle, and tens of thousands of soldiers would be unable to break out. At the Paris garrison headquarters, Charles pointed to the town of Saint-Marc on the map and said, "I plan to ambush tanks here." Ambush. Gallery didn't quite understand Charles's meaning. It's only a few kilometers from the enemy's lines. You think you can fool the Germans? I'm imposing an air blockade on this area. Charles drew a circle on the map with his finger. A radius of several kilometers, using machine gun planes to drive away German reconnaissance aircraft. That's far from enough, Major. They'll still get the information, Gallery replied. Tanks aren't easy to hide, especially in broad daylight. Then Gallery added, besides, I heard the Germans have deployed a unit in Saint-Marc because they're worried the French in the town might help us. With Germans in the town, what might happen? If the tanks attack the town, this small unit might not be able to hold it, but they would immediately relay the intelligence by telephone. An ambush here was simply a joke. Maybe, Charles persisted. But they won't know it's a tank. What do you mean? Gallery looked at Charles with suspicion. Are you saying the Germans won't recognize your new tank? If that was the idea, then Charles was underestimating the Germans. They would know it was a tank as long as it had armor and tracks. No, Charles shook his head slightly. I mean, it's not tanks attacking them, but sidecar motorcycles. Gallery said, oh, you're using sidecar motorcycles to launch the attack? The Germans will see sidecar motorcycles, not tanks, and they'll mistake it for a reconnaissance unit. Yes, Charles drew a small circle south of the town with a pencil. Our main force is roughly in this position, 30 Mark tanks. The German scouts will be drawn to this unit, and my new tanks will be disguised as tractors. Tractors? Gallery interrupted Charles. Tanks are much larger than tractors. My new tank is small, General. Charles smiled slightly. It weighs only about 8 tons. Note, Renault tanks vary slightly in weight depending on whether they are equipped with machine guns or cannons. The model equipped with a machine gun weighs about 7.5 tons. It was exported to my country. Zhang Zuolin purchased 14, and later the young Marshal acquired 36 more through various channels. Because of the iron hook at the rear, it has a nickname in my country, Iron Hook Tank. Only 8 tons. Gallery was taken aback. That was indeed about the same as a tractor. If a tank was that small, disguising it as a tractor wouldn't be a problem. But Gallery was still somewhat worried. How much combat power could such a light tank have? The Saint-Chamond tank weighed 27 tons, and the CA-1 weighed 14 tons. However, Gallery didn't ask this question aloud. He believed that whether it had combat power or not would be known after this battle. Charles's plan was successful. The Charles A1 tank was enclosed in a wooden frame and canvas, with a part above the tracks wrapped inside the frame. Moving behind the sidecar, it looked like a tractor transporting ammunition and fuel. Colonel Brownie classified this as a military secret, and only a few people knew the truth. The sidecar troops didn't recognize it either. It wasn't until the tanks arrived in Saint-Marcville and the wooden frames and canvas were removed that the French soldiers exclaimed in surprise, "These things are actually tanks. I thought they were bread carriers. This must be the smallest tank we have. Are we that poor?" It's understandable why the soldiers thought that way. It looked similar to the first generation of Char tanks, and the soldiers assumed that the tanks were so small due to budget constraints. Even Colonel Brownie, who commanded the unit, had doubts. The 37mm cannon, while a cannon, could such a small caliber penetrate enemy tank armor? Could it even damage enemy tanks? However, the actual combat surprised everyone. As soon as the battle began, a volley of shells from 6 Char A1 tanks equipped with cannons destroyed 3 German tanks. At a distance of over 200 meters, the shells easily penetrated their sight armor. Those big guys, seemingly behemoths, actually had defensive stats that were even inferior to the small Char A1 tanks. Then, as the German tanks slowly turned, another volley of shells struck one, shattering it and rendering it immobile. The gun barrels, however, continued to spin, seemingly aiming at a target. Brownie shouted, "Fire!" Instantly, gunfire erupted. Dozens of machine guns hidden in the residential area rained bullets at the enemy infantry behind the tanks, followed by volleys of mortar shells. Blood splattered as German infantry screamed and were pinned back, unable to advance. Facing the French lines, they were caught off guard by this barrage of fire and instantly separated from their tanks by French fire. The Char A-1 tanks then began to move, gliding sideways through enemy tanks, artillery fire, and dense machine gun fire. Shells exploded nearby, but none hit their mark. Even with suspension and aiming from a stationary position, the A-7V struggled to hit moving targets, especially small ones. Colonel Matteo, who had been watching the small tanks seemingly dodging shells through the observation port, suddenly snapped to attention when he saw the turrets of some tanks spinning. He shouted, "Turn! Turn! Keep facing them!" The drivers reacted instantly and began to turn, but the messenger's orders couldn't be received by the other tanks in time. The tank crews were in the heat of battle. They had neither the time nor the ability to notice the signal flags of command vehicle number 501. Then, just as Colonel Matteo had feared, the small tank, advancing while rotating its turret, suddenly came to a stop on a flat patch of ground. After a slight adjustment, the turret unleashed a volley of shells. The iron hook at the rear of the Renault tank is clearly visible in this blue sky white painted tank. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 210 Tank Generation Gap. If tanks at this time were classified into generations, then there was a generational difference between the Char A-1 and the A-7V tank. The Char A-1 tank's turret could rotate, while the A-7V tanks could not. This might seem like a small difference, since tank performance often hinges on the cannon's ability to penetrate enemy armor. However, in actual combat, this isn't always the case. Because the A-7V tank lacked a rotating turret, its gun's firing angle was severely limited. When a target was about to turn to the side, it was already too late to fire, requiring the driver to steer the vehicle. This could lead to an extremely awkward situation. The driver would turn and stop, the gunner would prepare to aim, only to find the target had moved out of the firing angle, requiring the driver to turn again. This cycle could repeat endlessly, potentially resulting in never being able to aim or fire. The Char A-1 tank, on the other hand, had a turret that could rotate in all directions without blind spots. After stopping, it could immediately aim and fire. The driver didn't need to know if it had hit. Upon hearing the gunshot, they would accelerate and continue moving, finding another flat area to repeat the process. This perfectly enabled stop and fire and move maneuver warfare. The driver and gunner didn't need much coordination. They could almost work independently yet still fight smoothly and without interruption. The two tanks also had unequal accuracy. The Char A-1 targeted stationary targets. The A-7V, on the other hand, was slow and clumsy, turning in place, its massive body resembling a giant, its side armor like a wall in front of the gunner, making it easy to hit without much aiming. The A-7V, however, targeted moving targets. Although the Char A-1 did stop briefly, these stops were extremely short. Coupled with the small size of the targets, before the A-7V could even aim, the Char A-1 had already fired a shell and started moving again. This kept the A-7V constantly on the move, without even a chance to fire, and they were destroyed one after another by the Char A-1 tanks. This scene stunned the French soldiers in the fighting. They had initially worried that the Char A-1 tanks would be taken out by a few shots from the A-7V, but instead, the Char A-1s were moving with the agility of monkeys, easily outmaneuvering these big guys. Even Colonel Brownie hadn't expected this situation. While directing his troops to continue suppressing the enemy infantry, he observed this first ever tank battle and thought to himself, the Germans are finished. The most devastated was the German commander, Colonel Matteo. He had thought his A-7V tanks would crush the enemy tanks with overwhelming superiority, but instead, they were being crushed by the enemy. After repeatedly turning but failing to hit their targets, Colonel Matteo decided to take a gamble. He shouted, "All machine guns, load K rounds." K rounds were prepared to counter the Mark I tank. Each of the 6 machine guns was equipped with a belt of 250 K rounds. Colonel Matteo waited a while, and the machine gunners responded one by one. Ready. Matteo then turned to the drivers and ordered, "Stop. Hold the line," Matteo reasoned. The A7V had firepower on all four sides, 2 machine guns on each of the other 3 sides in addition to the frontal cannon. If they could penetrate the enemy's side armor, then the A7V would still have a fighting chance. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat. Rat-a-tat-tat, the sound of the K-round firing was particularly crisp, the result of the intense friction between the steel core bullet and the rifling. Colonel Matteo stared intently at the targeted tank through the observation window, but reality filled him with despair. The target tank's turret was still rotating, completely unaffected. This was Charles's estimate. The K-round could penetrate 13 millimeters of steel armor at a range of 200 meters, and the side armor of the Charles A1 tank was set at 13 millimeters. 1 millimeter more would increase the weight, potentially affecting the tank's speed and maneuverability. 1 millimeter less would render it unable to stop the K-round. It required careful consideration. "Colonel, what should we do?" a German tank crewman shouted to Colonel Matteo. Colonel Matteo couldn't answer the question, because he didn't know the answer either. He only knew one thing: the A7V had lost completely, without a doubt. He looked out the observation window at the small tank, watching its turret slowly turn towards him. Colonel Matteo helplessly turned to his men, who were also looking at him, and said, "Pray." Before he finished speaking, a sharp clang rang out as a shell pierced the armor and struck the engine in the middle of the tank. Broken armor and shell fragments flew everywhere inside the tank, along with rivets that had been knocked out by the impact. They bounced around like bullets, filling the compartment with screams of agony. Colonel Matteo felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. He looked down to check his wound but couldn't see anything. The thick smoke from the engine had obscured everything, even making it difficult for him to open his eyes. Through the haze, Colonel Matteo sensed someone opening the tank hatch. Using his last bit of strength and his memory, he crawled to the hatch and peered out. A gust of cold wind blew in, and he felt a sense of relief. Finally, he could breathe some fresh air. Colonel Matteo's consciousness grew increasingly blurred, and he finally saw flames. The battle lasted only a dozen minutes, and the French achieved a complete victory. Of the 10 A7V tanks, only one retreated under the cover of German infantry. The others were either crippled on the ground or burned to ashes. One French Charles A1 had its tracks broken by shrapnel. This could also be considered a loss, as the French had no time to repair the tanks. In this race against time, it was impossible to halt the entire force because of one tank. For secrecy reasons, Brownie had explosives planted inside the tank before igniting the fuel tank. The French did not pursue the retreating Germans because the Samork Strait Road was not their target, although it could shorten the journey. The Germans had turned it into a trap. Charles, of course, wouldn't be foolish enough to let his troops jump into a trap. As for rescuing the trapped 2nd Special Artillery Division, all that was needed was to destroy the German howitzer regiment. French reconnaissance aircraft had pinpointed the exact location of the howitzer regiment, about 5 miles northeast of the town of Samok, supported by only 1 or 2 infantry companies. The Germans had committed almost all their forces to encircling the French, leaving their rear vulnerable and without sufficient troops to protect them. The French, with tanks and sidecars, would undoubtedly suffer another massacre against an artillery regiment with virtually no close combat capability. Inside the Samok Strait Road, Major General Tijani, half believing, assembled his troops on the north side of the road. The artillery fire continued intermittently ahead, seemingly a warning from the Germans. No one dared to advance easily, remaining hidden and waiting silently. This might be their last hope. If the shelling didn't stop as Charles had said, they would have no choice but to surrender. Suddenly, the artillery fire ceased abruptly. Tijani froze. Immediately, someone around him cheered excitedly, "We're saved." Charles did it. Chapter 211 God, we've been tricked. The German howitzer positions were a scene of devastation, littered with overturned howitzers from tanks and groups of German artillerymen kneeling on the ground in surrender. Colonel Brown simply ordered them to hand over their weapons and then destroy the artillery before releasing them. Several Western European countries were more humane towards prisoners of war. Their combat philosophy had a touch of chivalry. In their minds, fighting was one thing, fighting for one's country against the enemy, and giving one's all was expected. Like a knight shedding blood for the emperor, it was an honor, a spirit. But if defeat could not be reversed and the outcome irreversible, then surrender was the right thing to do. After surrendering, One was no longer a soldier, and everyone should treat each other amicably. Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin, German General Staff Headquarters. Falkenhayn was frantically mobilizing every available unit, all with the same goal, to reinforce tram and roads. These are Tsar's elite troops. Falkenhayn paced excitedly behind his desk, saying as he walked, "They've been fighting under Tsar's orders since the Battle of the Marne. They know Tsar's tactics and his equipment. If we can encircle and annihilate them, it'll be like cutting off Tsar's left and right arms." There was something Falkenhayn didn't say. He hoped to capture a few prisoners so he could learn Tsar's new tactics and equipment from them, which might even advance the German army. This was especially important to Falkenhayn. He even considered the two so-called special artillery divisions of France unimportant. If possible, he wouldn't mind if they broke out first. Falkenhayn was more than willing to exchange them for Tsar's first tank brigade. "We must stop them, Tsar's troops, at all costs," Falkenhayn muttered to himself. Colonel Moritz understood. The strategic value of Tsar's troops to the German army was immeasurable. Perhaps Charles himself didn't realize this, which was why he so readily sent this unit into the encirclement. Suddenly, a communications soldier reported in a panic, "General, Charles's troops have routed our 1st Tank Regiment. 2 tank platoons, battalions, have been almost completely wiped out, and Colonel Matteo has heroically died in action." Falkenhayn abruptly stopped, turning to stare in astonishment at the communications soldier. "No, this is impossible. How could the Mark I, without artillery, instantly defeat the 1st Tank Regiment, which possessed artillery?" Colonel Moritz said nothing, but strode forward and snatched the newly decoded telegram. He glanced at it quickly, then looked up at Falkenhayn. "General, it's true. Charles has deployed new tanks." "New tanks?" Falkenhayn was stunned, his expression blank. "But why didn't we hear anything? Those are tanks. It's over 10 kilometers from Rhodes to Samak, taking at least an hour. How come no one noticed?" Moritz considered for a moment, then guessed, perhaps Charles intentionally concealed its existence. He deliberately made us focus on the Mark I, then this new tank suddenly appeared to catch us off guard. Before he could finish, Colonel Moritz froze, realizing another possibility. Falkenhayn understood too. He and Moritz exchanged a glance, both seeing shock in each other's eyes. "God, we've been tricked," Colonel Moritz exclaimed. "He made us believe he only had Mark I, leading us to mistakenly believe the French could only break out from either tram or roads." No, Colonel Moritz walked helplessly to Falkenhayn. "We should have turned the troops back. Charles will break out from the Cape Town area, just as we thought. They'll attack from both sides." Falkenhayn shook his head slightly, looking helpless. "It's too late, Moritz. Charles tricked us." He succeeded again. Moritz took out his pocket watch, checked the time, glanced at the map, sighed deeply, and nodded slowly. Falkenhayn was right. From the moment Charles broke through the Rhodes defenses, the German army had urgently redeployed troops to reinforce the flanks, and it had been an hour and a half. This meant that turning these troops back would also take an hour and a half. That was enough time for Charles's troops to bypass the Samak Strait Road and reach Lorca. The actual situation was much faster than they had imagined. The Tsar A-1 tank, equipped with a more advanced suspension system, could reach speeds of up to 13 kilometers per hour and could travel continuously for over 30 kilometers without maintenance. This was also largely due to its lighter weight. The same tracks supporting 8 tons on the Tsar A-1 were a completely different matter from those supporting 17 tons on the Mark I. Furthermore, the 1st Tank Marching Corps maintained infantry-tank cooperation. Sidecar motorcycles scouted the terrain ahead, placing small flags as warnings on muddy or hard surfaces. Note: some highway bridges were paved with uneven stones. If a tank crossed at high speed, the tracks could break upon impact. Reconnaissance aircraft also participated, constantly dropping intelligence reports. Small enemy forces ahead, German supply convoys ahead, German engineers ahead. The sidecar motorcycle units would strike first, defeating and capturing enemy forces, and repairing craters if necessary. The Tsar A-1 tanks following behind naturally progressed smoothly. As for the Mark I tanks, Colonel Ostini commanded them to gather in a pile at the intersection of the highway and Samak, open their fuel tanks, and set them on fire. Their final mission was to block the enemy's retreat, preventing them from quickly catching up. Lorca, directly behind Cape Town. Major General Tigeny led the 2nd Special Artillery Division here and successfully joined forces with the 1st Special Artillery Division. Amid the cheers of the soldiers, a disheveled Major General Christine found Tigeny, and the two clasped hands tightly. Christine led Tigeny crouching low into a makeshift artillery shelter. This was enemy-controlled territory, and he dared not be careless. Before entering the shelter, Christine glanced at Tigeny's troops, a hint of surprise flashing in his eyes. Before the battle, Christine had looked down on Tigeny. He didn't believe that someone like Tigeny, who had become a major general through connections, could achieve anything on the battlefield. Seeing that his team still had over 30 St. Chamond tanks and CA-1s, Christine couldn't help but look at Tigeny with new respect. "Well done, General Tigeny," Christine said with a look of shame. "I abandoned all those tanks, not a single one of them," Tigeny replied awkwardly. "If it weren't for the Cheryl troops, we wouldn't have gotten here at all, let alone those tanks." Then he added, "Actually, I should have left them to the enemy, they seem almost as good as vases." Tigeny thought to himself. At least vases are pleasing to the eye, but these tanks would kill people. Chapter 212 is a psychological war. It might still be too late. Chapter 3 will be released later. It takes me more than 2 hours to write a chapter, so I'm often late. Sorry. Tigeny's gaze swept over the observation hole, surveying Christine's troops outside the artillery bunker, his eyes filled with envy. "I'd rather bring back more men, General Christine." Tigeny's troops were surrounded by the Germans in the Samak Strait Road, suffering artillery fire and crossfire from both sides, losing at least 5,000 men. More importantly, his troops were demoralized and almost surrendering, while Christine's 1st Special Artillery Division maintained its morale. Christine smiled bitterly. "We were also rescued by Charles." Tigeny turned around in surprise, his eyes filled with astonishment. "You too?" He had thought that Charles's troops had made a single flank infiltration, and could only rescue the 2nd Special Artillery Division, but it seemed that Christine's troops had also been rescued by Charles. Christine nodded, her eyes filled with complex emotions, and her words tinged with resentment. "Charles guided us through the breakout route by plane, which played a crucial role," Tigeny exclaimed. "Oh. Planes can detect enemy activity, they can see far more than we can." "It's not just that," Christine shook her head slightly. "Can you think of breaking out via the Tram River?" The Tram River. Tigeny, having participated in the operation, certainly knew of the river. It was a small river west of the quarry. Christine nodded heavily and succinctly described the entire process. "Charles ordered us to abandon all heavy equipment and break out via the Tram River. The Germans thought it impossible for us to break out in that direction because the fewest troops were deployed there. Our troops used mortars to suppress fire on the opposite bank, waded through the water, and then engaged in close combat with hand grenades." Tigeny understood. This wasn't just about aerial reconnaissance, but also about Charles's tactical guidance to Christine. Christine was a seasoned veteran, while Charles was only 17, a major who had never seen combat, yet he had guided Christine and achieved victory. No wonder Christine looked somewhat embarrassed. He seemed to be blaming himself for not thinking of this method. What Tigeny didn't know was that Christine was thinking about more than just that. Before the battle, he had defied Joffre's objections and pressured the authorities to equip a batch of mortars. If he hadn't done so, wouldn't they have suffered half their casualties just to break through to this point? Why was everything related to Charles? Tactics, mortars, grenades. Just then, a soldier shouted, "Enemy activity, east." Everyone tensed up. Christine quickly crawled out of the bunker and directed the troops to turn their guns eastward. This was the awkward situation of being surrounded in enemy-controlled territory. They couldn't even be sure which direction the enemy would appear from. Then someone exclaimed, "Tanks, German tanks, prepare for battle." Christine shouted, raising his binoculars to look in the direction the sentry had indicated. Sure enough, a few kilometers away at the other end of the road, the silhouettes of several tanks appeared faintly in the binoculars. They were clearly not Mark I tanks, they were undoubtedly German. "General Tigeny," Christine turned to Tigeny, who had caught up, and asked, "You don't mind letting me command your tanks?" "Do you?" "Of course, I have no objection," Tigeny readily agreed. He had long been worn down by the battlefield and had lost all confidence. His mind was blank, and he didn't know what to do. Just as Christine was about to give the order, a plane swept overhead, dropping an intelligence bottle with a whooshing sound. Soon, someone shouted excitedly, "Those are our men. It's the Cheryl troops, and the Cheryl's new tanks." A cheer erupted from the crowd, and Christine and Tigeny breathed a sigh of relief. Christine was still somewhat uneasy. He continued to observe the approaching group through his binoculars until he saw a convoy of sidecar motorcycles ahead, and they were wearing bright red military trousers. Only then did he order the alert lifted. He hesitated for a moment, then turned to Tycoon and said, "We should prepare for a breakout, Major General Tycoon." "A breakout?" Now, Tycoon looked surprised. Christine nodded firmly. The faster the breakout, the better, and Charles probably thought so too. His only worry was that the tanks seemed a bit small. Could they carry the troops through the breakout smoothly? As it turned out, Christine's worries were unnecessary. The performance of the Charles A1 tank in the breakout was nothing short of impressive. Its frontal armor was 25 mm thick, the penetration thickness of a German anti-tank rifle at 200 meters. This still seemed dangerous, but the mortars had a range of 700 meters. Once a mortar operator spotted a large gun in the trench, he would immediately focus on that spot. Then, just like the previous tank tactics, the tanks led the infantry forward, grenades were thrown into the trenches, and the infantry surged forward, tearing a gap in the German lines. Before the war, many worried whether small tanks like the Char A1 could successfully cross the trenches. However, actual combat proved everyone wrong. The Char A1 had a tailhook at the rear, so crossing trenches wasn't exactly smooth sailing, but it was just a slight bump, and the driver barely felt the process. The image above shows a Renault tank crossing a trench without a tailhook. The image above shows a Renault tank crossing a trench with a tailhook. The tailhook helps maintain the tank's balance as it crosses the trench. When Major General Tycoon saw these tanks crossing the trenches one after another, his previously dejected expression seemed to return to normal. While directing his troops to break out, he excitedly shouted, "This is a tank! A real tank! A tank that can fight!" At that moment, he made a decision. His idol was no longer Napoleon, but the Char. Because Napoleon couldn't build such equipment, it was practically born for war, an art of warfare, the world's most cutting-edge and exquisite invention. The soldiers didn't think as much as Tycoon did. They only knew to follow the tank brigade, break through the lines, and then expand their gains through the opening created by the tanks. At the Berlin General Staff, when Fouquet received intelligence that the Cape Town counter line had been breached, he only sighed softly. Although it was expected, he still felt resentful when the moment actually arrived. Looking back now, he could have won this battle. If he had simply held Cape Town, no matter which direction Charles broke out in, his flank would have been exposed to the 4th Reserve Army. However, he made a series of erroneous troop deployments because he was overly worried about Charles's tactics, which gave Charles the opportunity. Otherwise, just 9 tanks, even if they were Charles's newest tanks, wouldn't have been enough to break through the lines. Charles wasn't just fighting with tactics or equipment, he was fighting with psychology. He had mastered the psychology of his opponent. Chapter 213 Wells Considerations. In the final moments, Fouquet attempted to force the German 4th Reserve Army to continue encircling the French forces in the Cape Town area, but this was futile. The French 1st Tank Brigade, with nearly 40,000 men from 2 special artillery divisions, advanced into the heart of Cape Town, the core area of the German 4th Reserve Army, especially the Cape Town railway station, which was piled high with ammunition and supplies transported from the rear. After capturing the station and replenishing their supplies, the French burned it, along with the railway station, to ashes. Meanwhile, Joffre cooperated by launching a frontal attack on the German lines. Joffre had no choice but to cooperate. If he dared to try anything while 40,000 French troops were surrounded, it wouldn't just be a question of whether the commander-in-chief of France would remain in his position, but whether he would be court-martialed. Beset by internal and external troubles and on the verge of collapse, the German forces in Cape Town chose to refuse Fouquet's orders and deliberately created an opening for the French to break out. This decision was correct. They only retreated 3 kilometers to the second line of defense, and most of Cape Town remained in German hands. If they had continued to obey Fouquet's command and held on, a complete collapse and the loss of Cape Town were possible. At the Paris garrison headquarters, the moment they received intelligence of the successful breakout, the staff cheered and congratulated Charles. "A brilliant battle, Charles. You've fooled the Germans several times. You've played them like puppets." I believe this includes Fouquet. The staff smiled knowingly. Cobno seized the opportunity, snapping away with his camera, then began an interview with a notebook in one hand and a pen in the other. "Major, I heard you weren't very confident about this battle before the war." "Yes," Charles said frankly, It was almost impossible to succeed if the Germans hadn't withdrawn their forces from Cape Town. So, what were your reasons for ultimately deciding to send the 1st Tank Brigade to reinforce them? Charles turned his gaze to Gallieni, implying that the question should be directed at Gallieni. Gallieni hummed in agreement, took a sip of his coffee to moisten his throat, and answered without batting an eye, "I know the answer to that question." When Charles learned that over 40,000 men were trapped in an enemy encirclement and in imminent danger, his first order was to send the 1st Tank Brigade to reinforce them. Charles was taken aback. The truth seemed to be different. But Gallieni continued, his face serious. "I initially refused. I said, it's too dangerous, Major. No matter how many reinforcements you send, they might not return." A lie. Those were clearly Charles's exact words. But Charles insisted. He didn't hesitate for a moment. He righteously questioned me. "Those are 40,000 lives, 40,000 families. Even if it's dangerous, even if there's only a 1% chance, we should try, liar. That's clearly your intention." I was deeply moved by Charles's spirit. He was so dedicated, he was willing to give everything for the country, the army, and the citizens of France. That's him, that's Charles. Charles was starting to get emotional, but he noticed that the staff around him were all deeply moved, some even with tears in their eyes. Cabra was also taking notes intently. If it were anyone else, they might not have believed it, or even considered it a joke. But this was Charles. He had done so much to save the country and the army. How could anyone not believe him? If anyone did, it would be an insult to France. Finally, Gallieni concluded, I was convinced by him and gave him full authority to command this rescue operation. He was right. He successfully rescued our people. A round of enthusiastic applause erupted in the office. The staff officers rushed forward to shake hands with Charles. "Thank you, Charles. Thank you for your contributions to France. You are a pride." Charles was at a loss for words, casting a questioning glance at Gallieni, who, however, leisurely sipped his coffee, acting as if it were none of his business. Just then, the phone rang. Gallieni answered. "Hello. Yes, he's here, of course." Gallieni gestured with the receiver towards Charles, a smile in his eyes. "Wells, he's looking for you." Charles took the phone and identified himself. A steady yet slightly trembling voice came from the other end, seemingly trying to suppress his excitement and make his voice sound as official as possible. "Hello, Major. This is Wells." A truly impressive command, very brilliant. "I would like to say that if you need anything in the future, I would be very happy to serve you." "Thank you, Mr. Wells," Charles replied calmly. "It's what we should do. In a battle, as soldiers, we must find a way to win. Each of us should do our best." Wells on the other end of the line repeatedly agreed. "Yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you again." He then hung up without saying anything more. In fact, both sides understood each other implicitly. Wells was showing his support for Charles, and Charles was just being polite to avoid any appearance of impropriety. After Wells hung up the phone, the butler, Dennis, couldn't help but ask, "Sir, are we really going to switch our allegiance to Charles?" Wells nodded slightly. "Have you forgotten that Schneider is also our competitor?" The butler didn't say anything more upon hearing this. Schneider started in the steel and forging industry. Its advantage was that it could obtain the steel needed to build warships from its own steel mills. Therefore, although its experience in warship production was not as extensive as Brest shipyard, it had a price advantage and was highly competitive. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Wells's actions were not problematic. The butler was puzzled because Wells had always been unwilling to directly confront Schneider. Why now? Wells ignored the butler. He walked to the window and sat down in a rocking chair, gently swaying. The butler said nothing, left the room, and quietly closed the door. This was Wells's habit for thinking. The rocking chair made him feel like a warship sailing on a calm sea. Only then could he think things through clearly. Wells chose Charles not because he had saved Digenie's life, though a favor. It wasn't significant enough to warrant full support. Wells recognized Charles's keen and accurate battlefield foresight. He was capable of producing tanks that crushed all opponents, including the Saint-Chamond, the CA-1, and Germany's new tanks. They were all utterly ineffective against Charles. Could Charles also foresee the future direction of the Navy? A single word, a hint, could potentially put the French Navy, currently in a state of confusion, back on track. This could also help the Brest shipyard out of its predicament. Chapter 214. This day is finally coming. After the victory, Charles received mostly blessings and good news. His only complaint was that he was once again the center of attention in Paris. That evening, around 7 p.m., less than half an hour after the successful breakout, groups of Parisians gathered outside the city's defense headquarters to cheer. It was already dark, and snow was falling outside. The freezing weather couldn't dampen the Parisians' enthusiasm. They shouted upstairs, "Thank you, Charles, you saved my son. I received news that André is safe. He asked me to express my gratitude. You are a hero of France." The loudest shouts came from military families. Many soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Special Artillery Divisions came from Paris. This wasn't intentional. Many sons of nobles or capitalists had squeezed into these divisions through connections. These wealthy and powerful officers would bring their familiar soldiers with them, resulting in a large number of Parisians or people living in the surrounding area among the troops. The families of the soldiers were extremely anxious when they learned that the troops were surrounded. They hoped that Charles would take action but lacked the power and channels to voice their concerns. Now, knowing that Charles had successfully led the troops to break out, they were overwhelmed with gratitude and spontaneously gathered here to express their thanks. Charles secretly glanced through the window at the sea of people outside, at least tens of thousands of people, surrounding the 4th District, where the city defense command was located, in layers upon layers, causing the police to be urgently dispatched to maintain order and manage traffic. Under the streetlights, many people had snowflakes covering their shoulders, yet they still refused to leave. What do they want? Charles wondered. Was this how people in this era idolized celebrities? Cobno leaned in and explained, "Some soldiers didn't return. Their families hope you can find a way." Charles fell silent. Of the more than 40,000 troops, only more than 32,000 managed to break out. More than 10,000 were dead or missing. But Charles was powerless. This was all he could do. Soon, Charles learned that this wasn't the only bad news. General, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, after receiving a phone call, looked nervously at Gallery. "Captain Carter is on the phone. 5 planes are still missing, including a machine gunner." Gallery was taken aback, then immediately looked at Charles. Charles shook his head slightly. This was also beyond his control. Now, he could only hope that the machine gunner had crashed or landed in French-controlled territory, otherwise, the aerial battle would soon officially begin. Wilhelmstrasse, Berlin. The General Staff's phones rang one after another, all inquiring about the battle situation and even questioning whether there were any follow-up plans to turn the tide. Falkenhayn had completely given up. He refused to answer questions, leaving everything to Colonel Moritz, and sat alone on the edge of the bed in the lounge. He slumped over, his head hanging low, his hands weakly supporting his knees, like a defeated rooster. Falkenhayn didn't know how to report to Wilhelm II. Several versions of his plan flashed through his mind. "Your Majesty, this is a command error on my part. We were deceived by the Charles. Your Majesty, it's due to lack of intelligence. We didn't know the Charles had deployed new tanks. We lack air superiority. Although the enemy is surrounded, the intelligence has always been unequal. The enemy knows everything about us and can even command ground troops from aircraft, while we are completely unaware of their actions." However, no matter which version he came up with, it couldn't conceal the fact of defeat. Wilhelm II had been supporting Falkenhayn's Western Front strategy under immense pressure. Now, it seemed he had no choice but to shift the strategic focus to the Eastern Front. At that moment, Colonel Moritz pushed open the door forcefully and shouted, "General, you should answer this call. I told you." Falkenhayn abruptly raised his head, rudely interrupting Colonel Moritz. "I won't answer any calls, none of them." Colonel Moritz persisted, "No, General. This call is different. It's about the secret of the Charles aircraft. We've captured a plane with machine guns." Falkenhayn was utterly shocked. After a moment of stunned silence, he jumped up as if pricked by a needle, running towards the command post while shouting incoherently, "Have them protect it. Where's it? Which phone?" The staff officer held the receiver high, and Falkenhayn rushed forward and snatched it, impatiently asking before the other person could speak, "Are you sure it's the Charles machine gun plane?" "We're not quite sure, General," the voice on the other end replied, "but it does have 2 machine guns in the nose. It looks like it." "How did you capture it?" Falkenhayn asked again. "It made an emergency landing due to a fuel tank leak. The pilot seemed to be trying to sabotage something, but we stopped him in time." Falkenhayn was overjoyed. This was almost certainly the case, otherwise, the pilot's attempt to sabotage would mean he was trying to cover up a secret. Falkenhayn practically shouted the order, "Protect it immediately." Mobilize all your forces, including the pilots. Don't allow anyone near it. Nobody, he added, don't let anyone know, understand, understood. After hanging up, Falkenhayn looked up and ordered everyone, put everything aside and immediately organized troops and vehicles to bring it back. The staff officers immediately sprang into action, some mobilizing troops, others contacting vehicles and personnel. Falkenhayn couldn't sit still. He paced back and forth, saying to Colonel Moritz beside him, "Get ready, we're going there right now. I need to see it as soon as possible." Charles, along with Galleri and several staff officers, rushed to the headquarters of the 1st Air Group. Galleri hoped to use the resources at hand to find the missing machine gun aircraft as quickly as possible. Upon seeing Carter, he shook his head and reported, "Still no news." It was a plane from the 2nd Squadron, covering the breakout of the troops. During the battle, it got separated from the other crew members, and then nobody knew anything about it. At this time, planes weren't equipped with radios, so once the battle started, it was basically an independent operation. Moreover, the planes were fast. After a few dives and pull-ups at the target, the crew would be gone, and their location was entirely a guess. Headquarters couldn't even get any information about them. All they could do was wait at the airport. Only after a while, when the plane hadn't returned, did they realize something might have happened, and even then, it was only a possibility, still uncertain. Galleri wasn't willing to let any opportunity slip by. He directed his staff to make phone inquiries to everyone in the vicinity of where the plane had disappeared. But Charles realized that this day was finally coming. Chapter 215 8 Rules of Air Combat. Chapter 3 will be posted later. I apologize. Carter was clearly the most nervous. While Galleri was busy searching for the plane's whereabouts, Carter, pale-faced, asked Charles, "Major, if the plane falls into enemy hands, will they quickly learn this technology?" Charles nodded slightly. Machine gun firing coordination device wasn't high-tech. The Germans could understand its principle just by seeing it, and replicating it wouldn't be difficult. Carter sighed, blaming himself. This is a disaster. If enemy planes are also equipped with machine guns, it will threaten the entire sky and the lives of pilots. Carter felt it was his responsibility. "This has nothing to do with you, Captain," Charles comforted him. "This day will always come. It will happen as long as we carry out missions." "I know, Major," Carter replied anxiously. "The problem is we are far from prepared. Last time you had us conduct air combat drills, many people didn't take it seriously, and even those who didn't know how to practice. Coupled with the missions that followed, therefore," Charles nodded in understanding. "The pilots didn't take the drills seriously because of a complacency mentality. The first flight group held absolute air superiority. They had machine guns while the enemy didn't. In this state of absolute safety, they felt no pressure, and mere verbal orders weren't enough to provoke their attention. Some pilots were willing to practice, but it was just practice. They found it difficult to enter a war-torn state of it's all or nothing. It was normal to struggle to find a training direction." After a moment's thought, Charles slowly said, "First rule, observe the sun's position and try to keep your back to the sun." Carter, who had been looking dejected and with his head down, was stunned by these words and looked up at Charles in disbelief. He had several years of flying experience and had been studying air combat recently, so he understood what Charles meant. The sun's position was crucial. Facing the sun directly would blind you, allowing you to only vaguely see the backs of enemy aircraft, while the enemy could comfortably see their planes illuminated by the sunlight. Was this an air combat principle? Wait a minute, Major. Realizing this, Carter jumped up and ran to his desk, grabbed his notebook and pencil, and ran back to write the word sunshine on the paper. Charles continued calmly, "Secondly, once in combat, attack resolutely. Don't have any thoughts of retreating or running away." Carter wholeheartedly agreed. Aerial combat is different from other combat. Retreating or running away in aerial combat often means being tailed by the enemy, which puts you in a dangerous situation. Therefore, there is no turning back, you can only fight to the very end. Thirdly, Charles continued, only fire when the distance is very close. Carter quickly wrote the word distance. This was undeniable. Closer distance meant a higher hit rate. Ammunition was precious in the air. The two machine guns only had a total of 500 rounds, which could be used up in 30 seconds in principle. Firing indiscriminately, without considering accuracy, almost meant handing over the chance of success in one's own life to the enemy. The fourth rule, always keep a close eye on enemy aircraft and predict their feints. Carter hesitated for a moment. It wasn't that he disagreed with this rule, but rather that it was difficult. However, Carter immediately realized that this was the key to training. It required extensive training or experience gained in actual combat. Then came the 5th, 6th, 7th. Charles rattled off 8 rules in one breath. Carter, while writing them down in his notebook, stared at Charles in astonishment. He couldn't believe that such valuable experience had been summarized by someone who couldn't fly a plane and had never participated in air combat. Each of these rules was a golden rule, inviolable, otherwise, there might be no next chance for combat. Finally, Charles instructed, "You can have the soldiers train according to these 8 rules." "Yes, Major," Carter nodded heavily. "I will have them memorize these rules." "Not memorize," Charles interrupted Carter, "it's about making them a habit." Carter instantly understood and stood up to answer, "Yes, Major." "Not memorize, it's about making them a habit. It's like swimming. Memorizing the techniques is useless if you still make the same mistakes in the water. Only by practicing in the water, experiencing and correcting repeatedly until it becomes a habitual action, can one truly learn. The same applies to aerial combat. When enemy planes swoop down and spray bullets, the tension can make you forget everything in your mind, and by the time you realize your mistake, it may be too late. Only through constant practice can these skills become habits, allowing for reflexive and correct reactions in actual combat. Carter held the notebook with obvious delight, then looked at Charles curiously. "Major, you summarized all of this entirely, based on imagination?" "Mostly," Charles answered flawlessly. "Some I saw in combat, some I thought of while sitting in a plane." Charles was referring to the aerial combat he witnessed in Antwerp, where he had even commanded aircraft and escaped by plane, experiences that served as his perfect excuse. Carter didn't doubt him. He exclaimed, "Clearly, you have this talent, Major." In reality, it wasn't talent, but rather the 8 rules of aerial combat summarized by the German ace pilot, Polk. Polk shot down 40 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and summarized these tactics during the operation, some of which remain highly valuable even today. Charles couldn't help but wonder, wasn't it ironic to use German tactics against the Germans? At this time, Polk was not yet famous. What would he think if he saw Charles's 8 rules of air combat one day? He would be astonished. "This is strange. They are the same as my ideas." Charles actually summarized them a year ago. Gallery, having overheard some of Charles's conversation, jokingly remarked, "I remember someone saying they lacked experience in air combat command and refused to be a squadron leader on that basis. I didn't think of that at the time, General," Charles replied. This was the truth. Charles couldn't even fly a plane, let alone command a squadron. Now it seemed he was perfectly capable of the job, and no one else could do it better. Gallery smiled and nodded. "You mean to say it's your talent?" "I admit it." Charles was speechless. If it wasn't talent, what else could explain it? The image above is of Oswald Poker, the father of Luftwaffe tactics. Chapter 216 The Confused French Navy. Charles once again played hide-and-seek with the Parisian citizens, sneaking out a back door the next day when he was allowed to go home. Back in the town of Darvaux, he saw a large crowd blocking the town entrance, assuming it was another triumphant celebration organized by his neighbors. Charles, exasperated, had Major Laurent take a different route home in a different direction. However, when he arrived home, he found he had been beaten to it. A young officer, a major general, was sitting on the cheap sofa in the living room, chatting with Djoka. Charles assumed it was someone sent by Gerlini, and put his cap back on, saluting and calling out, "General." The young major general was startled, quickly putting down his coffee cup and standing up. He warmly shook Charles's hand, excitedly saying, You must be Charles, it's a great honor." "My name is Tijani." Charles felt the name sounded familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere before. Tijani explained, "I am Tijani, commander of the 2nd Special Artillery Division." Charles said, "Oh," recognizing the name from previous operations, though it had only been a code name then. Djoka smiled at Charles. "General Tijani is here to thank you for rescuing them." Camille emerged from the kitchen. "The general is very kind. He even brought a gift." "It's our pleasure," Tijani replied respectfully. "You have a very fine son, Mr. Djoka." "Mrs. Bernard." Camille smiled proudly. She liked it when people praised Charles like this, especially since he was a major general. Camille warmly invited Tijani to sit at the table and served them pizza. Djoka indicated he had already eaten and offered the table to Charles and Tijani. Charles knew Djoka hadn't eaten. He knew he should leave at this point, Otherwise he would inevitably overhear some military secrets. Without hesitation, Tycoon snatched a piece and began chewing like a ravenous man, exclaiming, "It's delicious, Mrs. Bernard. I think I'll eat it all." "You probably wouldn't like it, General," Charles scoffed at the blatant flattery. He remembered Tycoon's status, Wells' only son, always living a life of luxury. Why would he be so interested in a pizza? "No, Major," Tycoon smiled slightly, continuing to chew. "I'm not like what you think, indeed," Charles replied bluntly. "For example, your family owns half of France's warships, yet you joined the army and became a major general." Charles's tone was laced with sarcasm. His unspoken message was, "Go wreak havoc on the Navy, don't come and wreak havoc on the army." Tycoon wasn't stupid, he understood Charles's meaning, but he wasn't angry. He answered vaguely, "Major, do you think the French Navy has a future?" "That's none of my business," Charles replied directly. "I'm in the army, I don't know anything about the Navy." Tycoon hummed in agreement, "I don't know much either. Let me just tell you a few things I do know. Regarding warships, they're divided into two factions. One advocates the so-called Green Water Navy, and the other is the traditional Navy, Green Water Navy." Charles was taken aback. This was something he didn't know. The Navy had practically no presence in World War I and World War II, its most well-known activity being the mass scuttling of ships to avoid capture. "Yes," Tycoon said, enjoying his food, "the idea of the Green Water Navy is to fight with small, fast boats equipped with torpedoes. They believe this can solve everything." Charles said, "Oh." Hoping for a small victory against a large one. This was indeed very tempting, because even a powerful battleship could be taken down with just one torpedo. Although the hit rate of torpedoes at that time was not high, if a large number of torpedo boats were developed to fire salvos at a target, the image above shows an early torpedo boat, first invented by the British, but the French Navy, which was at a disadvantage, believed it could overtake them, leading to the Green Water Naval School in mass production. "We now have at least 200 torpedo boats," Tycoon said. The Green Water Naval School believed this was the future trend of the Navy, and only realized they were lagging behind after discovering the emergence of dreadnoughts in Britain. Dreadnoughts were the dominant force at sea during this period. Their concept was to unify the guns of battleships of varying calibers as much as possible, possessing one or two main guns of the same caliber. The advantages of doing so were obvious. Main guns of the same caliber and model would have similar trajectories, and in wartime, a single calculation of parameters could determine the impact range of a dozen or even dozens of main guns. It could even operate through test firing, calculate the firing data, fire one gun, observe the impact point, calculate the offset to correct the firing data, and then test fire again. Once within range, the remaining guns would fire simultaneously. If the enemy battleships didn't have a unified gun caliber, they would need to calculate multiple firing data, each potentially incorrect, putting them at a disadvantage in actual combat. "We only have 3 dreadnoughts now," Tycoon said with a smile and a shake of his head. "While Britain has over 20, and Germany over a dozen. We, once the second largest navy, are now far behind. Even so, they still waver between a Green Water Navy and a traditional navy, building torpedo boats today and planning a new dreadnought tomorrow." Charles gave a blank his development direction uncertain, seemingly lost. Tycoon continued, "Submarines are the same. They're even divided into 3 factions. Some think submarines should use steam engines, some think they should use diesel engines, and some think they should be equipped with naval guns so they can fight enemy warships." Note, the image above shows a submarine equipped with naval guns, the Surcouf, which France began construction of in 1927 and called a cruiser submarine. Tycoon took a sip of milk, exasperated. "We were the first country in the world to achieve mechanically powered submarines, the first to achieve electrically powered submarines, and the first to carry torpedoes on submarines. But what about now?" Tycoon then concluded, "We no longer have a navy, they can't do anything. Isn't the army the same?" Charles countered. Charles was referring to the ambiguity and wavering. The army wasn't much better, a consequence of the political system of the Third French Republic. "I used to think they were pretty much the same." Tycoon stopped what he was doing and looked at Charles. "But now I realize that the army and the navy are 2 completely different things." The image above shows a torpedo from World War I. It had a short range and low hit rate. It was once fired at a distance of 150 meters and missed, but if it had hit, it could still cause a fatal blow. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. we warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 217, The Third Faction of the Navy. Charles finished his meal, downing his milk in one gulp as usual during his breakfast. Being forced to finish his milk by Camille had become a habit after a while. He felt uncomfortable if he didn't. Setting down his cup, Charles continued the previous topic. I guess you think the Army and Navy are different because of their construction cycles. The Navy's construction cycle was long. A warship could take several years to complete. Therefore, it could take the Navy several years to determine if an idea or experiment was correct, and even longer if there was no war for a long period. The Army, on the other hand, measured in months. For example, a prototype tank built on a tractor chassis with added steel plates could be produced in 10 days. If it wasn't tested and immediately put into production for combat, the results would be known within a month. No, Major, Tidjany shook his head slightly. I don't think so. You know, the Army is very stubborn. They are often blinded by their own preconceived notions, unable to see what is right and what is wrong, or driven by profit, reputation, or something else, and then they continue to be wrong. This was true. For example, many people knew that a one-sided offensive theory was wrong, but they were unwilling to admit it. Take, for example, the Red Army caps and trousers. Most people knew they were impractical for war, and the soldiers desperately wanted to replace them, yet they stubbornly used them for a year before finally changing them. Replacing uniforms, in particular, required virtually no technical skill and little cost. All it took was ceasing production of the existing uniforms and replacing them with a different style, or simply changing the color. But they just wouldn't do it. Why is that? Charles asked. Tidjany, like a ravenous man, devoured another slice of pizza, chewing as he replied, because of you, Major. Charles answered expressionlessly. You don't need to flatter me about the breakout, General. As a soldier, you should know this is a mission. You owe me nothing, I know, Tidjany replied calmly. But that's how I see it. Seeing Charles still unconvinced, Tidjany explained, you've defeated everyone who disagrees with you with facts, Major. You're always right, time and time again, and every time it's a crushing victory, from tanks to rocket planes, machine guns, and recently, the Charles A1's performance on the battlefield. Do you know what that means? Tidjany looked at Charles, pizza in hand. You will unify the Army's equipment. Before long, everyone will get used to it. Charles is always right. Even if he pulls out a revolver and hands it to a soldier on the front lines, the soldiers will believe they can win this battle with it. Tidjany stuffed the last bit of food into his mouth and summarized in a self-answering manner. At that time, will we still need to consider what equipment the Army should choose? No, there will only be one option, and that is Charles's equipment. Charles laughed. You're too naive. You've completely overlooked Schneider. Charles suddenly realized something and looked up at Tidjany. You're not here representing yourself this time, are you? Tidjany nodded with a half smile. You could say that, and you could say that. Tidjany was telling the truth. After Tidjany and his troops safely returned to Paris for rest, the first thing he wanted to do was visit Charles, but he was too nervous to act. This was something Tidjany had never experienced before. He didn't know why he was nervous, but there was a strange sense of panic in his heart. What if Charles looked down on someone like him, a useless person? What reason could he give to see Charles? Would it be a waste of his precious time to bother him? At this moment, Wells walked up to Tidjany and said expressionlessly, I need you to talk to Charles, Tidjany. This might be the only use you have for choosing the Army. Charles understood. Tidjany had become the bridge between Wells and Charles. Wells was the owner of the Brest shipyard, and in principle, he couldn't have too much personal contact with Charles. But Tidjany was different. He was a member of the military, an Army Major General. It was perfectly normal for him, having just been rescued by Charles, to meet with Charles to express his gratitude, and then become friends. What does Wells want? Charles asked. Charles knew very well that Wells wouldn't unconditionally side with him. Businessmen only care about profit. Tidjany wiped his mouth with a napkin and replied, one answer, he wants you to unravel the Navy's confusion, which has led to the shipyard's chaotic direction. My father believes your military genius might help the shipyard out of its predicament. Tidjany then added meaningfully, in fact, I think he's just as confused as the Navy. This was a double entendre. The confusion referred not only to the shipyard's future but also to the relationship between Wells and Charles. If Charles couldn't help the shipyard, or only minimally, Wells' support for Charles might be superficial. Charles considered for a moment. He decided he should win over Wells so he wouldn't be completely passive when facing Schneider and Greaves in Parliament. Thinking this, Charles hummed in agreement and asked, "If I give you an answer, can you convince the Greenwater Navy and the traditional Navy?" Tidjany replied, "That's our problem. At least knowing the direction will prevent the shipyard from constantly following the Navy's chaotic decisions down the wrong path." Charles agreed. Direction was equally important for a business. If Wells knew which equipment would prevail in the future, he could concentrate resources on related research and development. Naval research and development must be forward-looking, spanning years, decades. It's not an exaggeration to say that a wrong turn could lead to falling behind, and all investment would be wasted. Furthermore, Charles's research in the Army wouldn't compete with Wells's warships, and Charles's occasional flashes of inspiration might help Wells defeat his rival, Schneider. This was Wells's need of Charles, and the basis of their cooperation. Charles felt he had entered the threshold of dividing up the French military's equipment, at least for now, negotiating with Wells at the shipyard. After making his decision, Charles asked, "You just said the Navy is divided into two factions." "Yes, the Greenwater Navy and the traditional Navy," Tidjany replied casually. Charles asked again, "What if a third faction is correct?" Tidjany laughed, "There is no third faction." Before he finished speaking, Tidjany understood Charles's meaning. "You mean, neither faction is the future direction?" Charles nodded slightly. "But why?" Tidjany asked, puzzled. "I'm just curious." "And what does the third faction refer to?" Charles replied calmly, "The Greenwater Navy's torpedo boats, while theoretically feasible, are limited to coastal operations due to their tonnage. Traditional naval battleships, while possessing large guns and armor, are always slow. The third faction should combine the advantages of both." Tidjany suddenly realized, exclaiming, "Torpedo boat destroyers." The third faction is torpedo boat destroyers. The image above shows the first actual destroyer, originally designed to destroy torpedo boats, hence the name torpedo boat destroyer, displacing 275 tons. It was built in Britain in 1893, equipped with 176mm main gun and three 47mm guns, and could carry three 450mm torpedoes, with a maximum speed of 27 knots. Chapter 218 Naval Mobile Warfare. The development of the British Navy is quite interesting. It repeatedly invented its own natural enemies. During World War I, the British Navy was undoubtedly the world's best, far ahead in tonnage, numbers, and sophistication. At the top, it only needed to maintain this advantage and continue developing. Any unusual ideas should have been secretly developed. However, the British Navy's enterprising spirit was a boon to its adversaries. Or perhaps it was a sense of crisis. Possessing the most advanced battleships, it constantly sought cheap and simple equipment to defeat them. Thus, the torpedo boat was invented. Across the Channel from France, they were initially worried, what if their navy couldn't keep up with Britain? Britain was just across the Channel, only a little over 100 kilometers away, a 3-hour journey by battleship. If they angered Britain, it could easily annihilate the French navy and then encircle France from the sea. In the long run, would France become a British vassal? Would its African colonies become uncontrollable? Would its maritime trade be blockaded by Britain? However, Britain developed torpedo boats, much to the delight of the French Navy. While they couldn't compete with Britain in terms of regular warships, they could afford torpedo boats. 200 torpedo boats were produced, and development continued. The British Navy, however, was filled with regret. Had they not made things difficult for themselves? Why build torpedo boats? Now, any country could build a few and they could threaten battleships, potentially causing them to capsize unexpectedly. They needed to find a way to counter these torpedo boats. Thus, the torpedo boat destroyer was born. This vessel was equipped with larger engines, giving it a higher speed than torpedo boats. It also had main and secondary guns that could provide protection around battleships, even driving torpedo boats to a safe distance. Furthermore, it was small and inexpensive, so even if sunk by torpedo boats, it wouldn't be a significant loss. In addition, it was equipped with torpedoes, posing a threat to slow-moving battleships and proving to be a formidable force. The British Navy thought they could finally relax. The torpedo boats were now left to the torpedo boat destroyer. However, they probably never imagined that these destroyers, designed for menial tasks, would ultimately replace battleships entirely during World War II. "I still don't understand," Tidjany thought for a moment. then looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. Can torpedo boat destroyers compete with battleships? I mean, in the future, it doesn't need to compete with battleships, General, Charles replied calmly. It only needs to be faster than a battleship, and the battleship will never catch it. In its eyes, the battleship is practically non-existent. Naval warfare differs from land warfare. Land warfare allows for ambushes, surprise attacks, and is limited by roads. Naval warfare is vast and open. As long as the speed is sufficient, a slow battleship is almost impossible to catch, rendering its guns ineffective. This is why Britain developed battlecruisers alongside dreadnoughts. Battlecruisers sacrificed armor and firepower for speed, the only way to catch up with their targets. But if even battlecruisers can't catch destroyers, destroyers are perfectly capable of engaging in mobile warfare at sea. Note, battleships typically have speeds of 20 or 21 knots. Battlecruisers mostly 25 or 26 knots, while the first destroyer had a speed of 27 knots, and many later destroyers exceeded 30 knots. Tycoon was skeptical, but destroyers also can't get close to battleships. Charles interrupted Tycoon. First of all, destroyers don't necessarily need to get close to battleships. They can use their higher speed and better maneuverability to outmaneuver them. For example, they can attack ports or merchant ships not protected by battleships, or blockade shipping lanes. Tycoon paused, then nodded. He had studied Charles's tactics. It was similar to Charles using frigates in mobile warfare, leaving the powerful enemy behind and attacking their weak points. And the enemy couldn't possibly protect every port and every caravan with powerful battleships and cruisers. So, Tycoon nodded slightly. Our development direction is to continuously improve the performance of torpedo boat destroyers, equipping them with more advanced engines to increase speed, while also strengthening their firepower and armor. Charles nodded. Tycoon's comprehension was good. If other warships couldn't catch up with a destroyer, then the destroyer's opponent would be a destroyer that could catch it. To wage mobile warfare at sea, one should gain an advantage over the enemy destroyer in firepower, armor, and speed. Tycoon was secretly pleased. Before this, Tycoon had always worried that Charles's talent and equipment was limited to the army. If that were the case, his father wouldn't be able to cooperate with Charles for a long time. Now, hearing Charles's third-party idea, he felt that this viewpoint was both novel and reasonable, and could very well be a completely new tactic in naval warfare. His father might be satisfied with it. Then Tycoon eagerly asked, Major, judging from your tone, torpedo destroyers have other advantages? Of course, Charles replied. Torpedo boat destroyers carry torpedoes themselves. They're essentially enlarged torpedo boats, and they can also pose a threat to battleships. Tycoon frowned. But that's difficult. Approaching during the day is almost suicidal, and even if you manage a sneak attack at night, you might miss because you can't see the target clearly. Once discovered, escape is extremely difficult, and there's almost no chance of success. You're right, General, Charles replied, enunciating each word clearly. But that's now. What about the future? What if we improve the range and accuracy of the torpedoes? Tycoon's eyes widened instantly. He had never considered this direction. But upon reflection, it made sense. If the performance of the torpedoes could be significantly improved, it meant that destroyers could potentially hit battleships at greater distances. One day, if torpedoes could outrange battleship guns. Tycoon thought it over, and exclaimed involuntarily, God, if torpedoes are advanced enough, battleships will be no match for them. One day, they will be obsolete. Charles smiled without saying a word, tacitly agreeing. Actually, Charles was misleading Tycoon. What could truly change the landscape of naval warfare was aircraft. In Charles's mind, he envisioned bombers carrying torpedoes into the sea. No matter how fast a destroyer or how meticulously planned a surprise attack, it couldn't compare to aircraft carrying torpedoes. Aircraft were fast, inexpensive, and a single torpedo could potentially take down a battleship. What could be more cost-effective? However, Charles could develop aircraft but not torpedoes. That was where Wells came in. Chapter 219 A Gift of Pure Gold. Charles presented Tycoon with his seemingly plausible mobile naval warfare theory for two purposes. First, to use this theory to ensnare Wells and secure cooperation with the Brest shipyard. Second, to use Wells to develop torpedoes. Current torpedoes were too primitive. Even if they could be mounted on aircraft to bomb enemy warships, accuracy was extremely difficult, making performance improvements urgent. Charles believed he was likely to succeed. This wasn't just because Tigeny left with admiration and satisfaction, but also because Charles's mobile naval warfare theory was 7 parts truth and 3 parts falsehood. Destroyers would become the mainstay in the future. That was true. Torpedoes' range would surpass that of artillery. That was true. And mobile naval warfare, to some extent, was also true. The problem was, with the advent of aircraft carriers, naval warfare would become air warfare, and even the fastest destroyers couldn't outrun aircraft, rendering destroyer-based mobile warfare ineffective. But at least for now, while the Navy was unaware of aircraft carriers and hadn't recognized the importance of aircraft, this theory remained feasible. After Tigeny left, Camille curiously opened the gift he had brought. She exclaimed with delight, "A sailboat. It's so beautiful. We just need a decoration like this." With that, Camille moved the sailboat to the living room table and placed it there, complaining, "It seems a bit heavy, at least 4 or 5 pounds. Charles glanced at it. It was a 3-tiered sailing warship with cannons, some loading, some aiming, and many sailors and musketeers bustling about on the deck, looking tense and ready for battle. Most importantly, it was gleaming gold. Charles thought of something and reminded Camille, "Mother, you'd better not put it there." "Why?" Camille didn't turn around. Her gaze remained fixed on the sailboat. She took a few steps back, straightened up, and examined it carefully. "I think it's perfect here. It matches our living room." Charles rolled his eyes and glanced at the cheap furniture filling the room. Joka noticed Charles's expression. He stepped forward and touched it, then picked up the sailboat and weighed it in his hand, exclaiming, "My God, it's pure gold." Camille was taken aback, then laughed. "Are you kidding me? Who would give a gift of pure gold, weighing 4 or 5 pounds? But seeing Joka's serious expression, Camille asked with some doubt, "Is it really pure gold?" Joka nodded. He came from a capitalist background, so he had that kind of knowledge. "It's probably worth 60 or 70,000 francs, Joka gave a rough estimate after examining the sailboat. "If we only consider the price of gold and not its artistic value, but its craftsmanship is exquisite, it could be worth much more than that." Camille gasped and turned to Charles. "We should return it to the general, Charles. We can't accept such an expensive gift." "Don't worry, Mother," Charles replied calmly. "It's just a trinket to him. He won't care." "A trinket? A trinket worth 60 or 70,000 francs? Camille stared at Charles in disbelief. Joka understood the implication in Charles's words. He stood up and asked, "This general, he's not an ordinary officer, is he?" "Of course," Charles replied. "He's Wells's son, his only son." Joka and Camille exchanged glances. The man they had just met was Wells's son. In the 15th arrondissement of Paris, on the banks of the Seine, the church bells rang once in the distance. It was 10:30 in the morning. In a 5-story building built along the river, Wells, as usual, sat in a rocking chair by the window in his bathrobe, enjoying the cool breeze and watching the boats passing by on the river, watching the snowflakes fall from the sky, one by one, disappearing into the water. He liked watching boats. He thought they were fascinating things, life on board, death off the water, accidents could happen at any moment. To survive, one had to be prepared and consider every possibility in advance. But today, Wells was restless. Although his eyes were fixed on the river, his mind was on Tigeny and Charles's meeting. What would the result be? Surprise or disappointment? There probably wasn't much of a way out. After all, it was the Navy, relying on tonnage and cannons. If the entire French Navy couldn't do anything about it, what could Charles possibly think of? He would also choose a battleship. No one would refuse the cannons and defenses of a battleship, especially an infantry major who loved war. Wells felt somewhat ridiculous, actually placing his hopes on a 17-year-old boy. Footsteps echoed on the stairs outside, and Wells knew Tigeny had returned. Perhaps because Wells was convinced Charles was hopeless, he held no expectations, his gaze still fixed on the end of the Seine. "Father," Tigeny cautiously pushed open the door, closing it behind him as he walked to Wells' side. He looked spirited in his military uniform, though a naval uniform might have suited him better. Wells grunted in acknowledgement, gesturing for Tigeny to sit beside him, and casually asked, "How did the talks go?" "I'm not sure," Tigeny replied. "That's for you to decide." Wells had the authority to speak on this matter, while Tigeny, knowing he had abandoned the Navy, had no say. Wells rose and went to the liquor cabinet to pour himself a drink. He only had one. He didn't intend to give it to Tigeny, believing their relationship hadn't recovered to that point. "What did he choose?" Wells asked, his back to Tigany. He chose nothing, Tigany replied. Wells turned around in confusion. He didn't choose anything? He gave up. No, father, Tigany replied. He chose the torpedo boat destroyer. He said it was the third faction. Wells was taken aback, then hummed with interest. Torpedo boat destroyer? Interesting. What's the reason? He turned away again, took a sip of his wine, and seemed to be trying to guess Charles's intentions. Naval maneuver warfare, Tigany said succinctly. He believes torpedo boats can protect the coastline, while torpedo boat destroyers can engage enemy fleets at sea. As long as we're fast enough, we're invincible. Wells, who was about to bring his glass to his lips, paused upon hearing this and coldly asked, anything else? Therefore, we need to develop torpedo boat destroyers, Tigany replied. We need to increase the firepower and defense of torpedo boat destroyers, while ensuring their speed, so that we can quickly destroy enemy destroyers instead of being entangled by them. Then Tigany added, the key is torpedoes. As long as the torpedoes have a long enough range and high enough accuracy, destroyers may be able to sink battleships beyond their range. Wells didn't speak. He considered for a moment, silently took a glass, poured himself a drink, and turned to hand it to Tigany. Chapter 220 The wildly popular Charles A1. Charles didn't go anywhere that day, just stayed home sleeping, reading when he woke up, and sleeping again when he got tired. He only came downstairs for lunch when Camille called him. He didn't care about anything, didn't think about anything, political intrigue, business maneuvering, or battlefield power struggles. He cast them all to the back of his mind. It was then that Charles realized that these days, which he had previously considered dull, were actually quite wonderful. In the evening, when Joker returned from the factory and sat down at the table, he casually remarked, Count Spee didn't abandon ship in the end. He deserves respect. Count Spee, Charles asked. The Scharnhorst, you didn't know. Joker was somewhat surprised. Charles usually knew more about military matters first. A second later, Joker understood. Charles had stayed home all day, almost completely isolated from the outside world. It happened this morning, Joker explained. The exact time isn't clear, but the Spee fleet was almost completely wiped out. Only an auxiliary ship and a light cruiser escaped. A hint of regret crossed Joker's face as he said this. This was somewhat strange. Spee's fleet was the enemy, defeated by their ally, Britain, yet Joker wore this expression. Charles grunted but said nothing. This was the problem with naval warfare at that time. Slow warships had almost no chance of escape, and Earl Spee should have known this when he decided to attack the Falkland Islands. However, his retreat after a failed attack seemed somewhat hasty. Even if he had to retreat, he should have left one or two warships in key positions to provide cover. Even if sunk, they could block the British exit channels, giving the main force a chance to escape. Otherwise, they would simply be sunk one after another by the faster battlecruisers, without any suspense. The next day, when Charles returned to Paris to serve as usual, he had just entered the second-floor command post when the staff officers cheered for him again. Salute to Colonel Charles. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand even gave Charles a respectful salute, half-jokingly saying, Colonel, at least we don't have to call you sir anymore. As a lieutenant colonel, it was indeed awkward to address a major by his rank, but this wouldn't be a problem once Charles was promoted to colonel. Charles looked at Gallery with a puzzled expression. A promotion 2 ranks from lieutenant to major was understandable, that was for junior officers, but a promotion 2 ranks directly from major to colonel was rather exaggerated. Pétain became a colonel at 58, while Charles was only 17. Gallery seemed to understand Charles's thoughts. As he handed Charles the promotion papers, he said meaningfully, this is what you deserve, Colonel. You saved over 30,000 people. I don't think they'll have any objections. Besides, you could say this is an early coming-of-age gift. Charles's heart skipped a beat. He understood Gallery's meaning. Once Charles came of age, the restriction of not being able to go to the battlefield no longer applied. Even renowned figures like Foch in the French army personally commanded troops on the battlefield, so Charles would certainly be no exception. Therefore, Charles's rapid promotions during this period weren't just due to his military achievements, but also Gallery's deliberate manipulation. His intention was clear: if Charles were ever forced to go to the battlefield, the rank of colonel would undoubtedly bring him more resources. Charles silently compared his own power in Parliament, Steed's Republicans plus Wells's radical socialists, compared to Schneider's socialists and the right wing combined, still held a disadvantage. not to mention the dozens of other parties with deeply intertwined relationships. It seems there's no chance of turning the tide before adulthood. Another piece of good news, Gallieni nodded to Charles. How much do you plan to sell your Char A1 tanks for? Charles had already decided on a price and answered decisively, 30,000 francs, General. This time Charles had learned his lesson. The Saint Chamond tank cost 21,000 francs. The Char A1 was a tank capable of winning battles, so selling it for more than the Saint Chamond wasn't unreasonable. Actually, Charles had left Gallieni some room to negotiate, but Gallieni only frowned and grunted, unusually not trying to bargain. After considering for a moment, Gallieni asked again, I'd like to know, if we purchase a certain number of Char A1 tanks, will we be able to completely break through the enemy's defenses? Charles instantly understood Gallieni's meaning. Although Charles frequently achieved victories on the front lines, the overall situation remained stalemate between the two armies. Gallieni seemed to want to change this situation with the Char A1, but Charles shook his head and replied, I don't think so, General. The Charles A1 tank is still only suitable for short-range breakthroughs. It always suffers from track or other malfunctions. Besides, the enemy could possibly use some simple methods to stop the tanks from advancing. What methods? Gallieni asked, puzzled. Charles leaned closer and lowered his voice, replying, they just need to widen the trenches. Gallieni nodded with a no, indicating he understood. It was indeed a simple method. Actually, Charles didn't elaborate. As the saying goes, the devil is always one step ahead. If the Germans knew to dig anti-tank trenches, that is, to dig a trench deeper and wider than a regular trench in front of the position, and lay barbed wire and mines within it, then the tanks would be helpless against it. Of course, Charles wouldn't easily reveal this idea. It would be as foolish as Britain developing torpedo boats despite possessing the most battleships. One day, if the Germans found this method themselves, Charles would have to accept his fate. All right, Gallieni said with a hint of helplessness. The military plans to buy 500. Charles was stunned by the number. 500 tanks meant 15 million francs, a huge deal. But then he thought it wasn't surprising. This tank had sold over 3,000 units in just 1 year. This was just the beginning. Gallieni then handed Charles a list, saying, in addition, several other countries have also applied to our government to purchase this tank, including the United States. I think you should find time to talk to them. Yes, General, Charles replied. He took the list and looked at it, suddenly understanding why Gallieni wasn't negotiating. So many countries were vying for it, and the orders were substantial, with the United States even hoping to license production. This meant they wanted to produce a batch. If Gallieni were to try and negotiate at this point, Charles might find an excuse to reduce the supply. Charles thought to himself, it's different when there's competition. Next time, he should try to create this kind of buying frenzy. Or, he could find some shills to cooperate with. Chapter 221 Something seems amiss. Late again. Chapter 3 will be posted later, sorry. As dusk settled, the moonlight was soft and beautiful. Tigeny hosted a ball on the rooftop of the Ritz Hotel in the first arrondissement of Paris, inviting mostly officers rescued by Charles during the Battle of Cape Town, as well as many nobles and celebrities. Charles, entering the banquet hall, seemed quite unfamiliar with everything. The officers were engaged in lively conversation, their faces beaming, while the women exuded charm and the atmosphere was intimate. Neatly dressed waiters nimbly moved through the crowd, serving drinks to those who needed them. On the dance floor, men and women embraced and danced gracefully to the music, a scene of harmony and joy. Tigeny was discussing something with several elegantly dressed women when Charles entered. He casually took a wine glass from a waiter, tapped it with a spoon, raised the glass towards Charles, and shouted, "Gentlemen, let's toast to Charles, cheers." The officers in the hall cheered, their eyes all turning to Charles. Officers and women greeted Charles along the way, and Charles smiled and nodded in response, though he didn't recognize any of them. Tigeny warmly approached and shook Charles's hand, glancing at the gold thread on Charles's cuff and smiling. "Congratulations, Colonel." Charles looked displeased. "I think I told you, you don't need to flatter me about the breakout." "I know," Tigeny feigned innocence, "but it wasn't my idea. They thought they should meet you, at least to thank you in person." Sure enough, several officers stepped forward to introduce themselves, some even stating their unit numbers. Charles was somewhat speechless. So many people, so many names, he'd forget them all in a minute. "Next time, just ignore me," Charles said. He'd thought this was a meeting arranged by Wells, but it turned out to be a ball. Understood, Tijani readily agreed. But the faint smile on his face seemed to say something else entirely, more like, "You should get out and about, Colonel, this is life." Tijani took a glass of wine from the waiter and handed it to Charles, speaking in a low voice as he casually strolled along. "He's very satisfied with your plans, Colonel. He's already started developing destroyers and torpedoes." Charles grunted in response. This was Wells' reply, marking the first step in their formal collaboration. After this, a tacit understanding developed. Wells would provide Charles with support in Parliament and other potential avenues, while Charles would occasionally offer suggestions for the shipyard's development or inventions. Just then, several hearty laughs rang out from ahead. A woman in her 20s, with a ruddy complexion, chatted and laughed amidst the officers, seemingly at ease in the crowd, occasionally chiming in. Perhaps noticing Charles's gaze, the woman boldly waved and greeted him, her face radiant with spring. "Hi, Colonel, my little hero." Charles didn't respond, turning to look at Tijani. Tijani looked on incredulously. "Come on, you don't know her." Charles didn't answer, glancing around before heading towards the food area. In this banquet hall, the only thing that interested him was perhaps the large, bright red lobster. "Her name is Harley," Tijani caught up from behind. "A stripper, famous in Paris. Many people want to get close to her." Charles tore off a lobster leg, saying sarcastically, "Perhaps you're one of them." "No, Colonel," Tijani shook his head. "But you'd never guess who she'd hook up with." "Who?" Charles asked casually, chewing on some lobster meat. Tijani leaned closer and whispered, "The Minister of the Navy." Charles was startled, looking at Tijani with a puzzled expression. Charles had seen some information about the Minister of the Navy at headquarters and knew he was over 60 years old. Why would he still have such an interest? Tijani nodded slightly, then leaned closer and added mysteriously, "She's the Minister of the Navy's mistress." Charles's chewing of lobster slowed. Speaking of the Minister of the Navy, he remembered a woman who seemed to mingle among the officers, posing as a frightened young girl, chatting with them. Then, the drunken officers, bursting with protectiveness, would rush forward to tell her, "Don't worry, we have 5 divisions there, yes, and 2 artillery regiments. They'll wipe out any approaching enemy, they'll win, there will be an offensive soon." The Minister of the Navy had revealed even more intelligence to her. According to statistics, at least 3 divisions of French troops, 40 to 50,000 men, had died because of her. Even the British Army Commander-in-Chief, Kitchener, was intercepted and killed by a German submarine because of intelligence leaks. Thinking of this, Charles couldn't help but glance at Harley, who was currently flirting seductively with the officers, completely oblivious to the stares around her. This was the French intelligence system at that time. The Third Republic promoted checks and balances among departments and discouraged autocracy, leaving many military secrets unprotected. For example, Gallieni's City Defense Command, which should have been the second-tier command of the French army, still had many capitalist spies within it. If capitalists could easily obtain intelligence from the command, then spies could also obtain intelligence from the capitalists, thus rendering military secrets no longer military secrets. This was why Gallieni always discussed matters with Charles in the lounge. Tijani noticed Charles's unusual expression and asked suspiciously, "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing," Charles replied, refocusing his attention on the lobster. When Charles returned to the command, it was already past 10 o'clock at night. He saw that the light was still on in Gallieni's lounge. This was unusual, he should have been asleep by now. As Charles went upstairs, he faintly heard Gallieni talking to someone. Before he even got close, Gallieni, hearing footsteps, exclaimed, "It must be him." Before he finished speaking, a familiar figure strode out from the lamplight. Upon seeing Charles, the figure excitedly embraced him, exclaiming, "Long time no see, my friend." Charles looked closely and recognized him as Albert. "I, Your Majesty." Charles asked, "What brings you here?" Albert I patted Charles's shoulder warmly. "I came to Paris on some business and stopped by to see you." "How are you?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Charles replied. "I asked a pointless question," Albert I laughed. "I see your story in the newspapers almost every day. It's no secret." Gallieni, who had followed him out, interjected, "Colonel, we have some things to discuss." Charles felt a pang of unease. Something seemed amiss. Chapter 222 Charles's Influence. In the lounge, the lamplight cast 3 faint shadows on the desk. Gallieni's old injury seemed to have flared up again. He frowned and subconsciously rubbed his abdomen, but quickly relaxed and resumed his original expression. Charles noticed this and turned to make Gallieni a cup of coffee. "Thank you, Colonel." Gallieni was somewhat surprised as he took the coffee, then nodded slightly, a hint of relief and a smile appearing in his eyes. "It's like this." Albert I looked at Charles with a hint of expectation. "You've heard about the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, joining the Central Powers, haven't you?" "Yes, of course," Charles nodded. "This happened last month, shortly after the Battle of the Marne. It started when Britain withheld 2 dreadnoughts ordered by the Ottoman Empire to fight in the war, refusing to refund the money. Germany exploited this and sowed discord, ultimately leading to the Ottoman Empire joining the Central Powers." Gallieni scoffed. "British arrogance, indeed. The British hadn't taken the Ottoman Empire seriously, they hadn't shown the most basic diplomatic respect." Albert I didn't comment further. As the king of a small country, it wasn't appropriate for him to comment on Britain. Albert I spread a map on the table, pointing to it, and said, "After this, many people thought that if we couldn't break through from the front, should we open a new battlefield by landing on the enemy's flank or even rear?" Charles glanced at Gallieni. Not long ago, Gallieni had asked Charles a similar question: could the Charles A1 break through the enemy's lines from the front? Charles's answer was no, which was why Gallieni had switched his support to the British flank and rear landing. Gallieni didn't speak, only taking a small sip of his coffee, which was taken as tacit agreement. "There are several options for a flanking landing," Albert I said, oblivious to their expressions. "Some think we should land from the Baltic Sea in the north, while others believe we should land from the Mediterranean Sea in the south." The debate has raged on. Charles was puzzled. "But this doesn't seem to concern us. We're the army. This is the Navy's business." Gallieni's lips curled into a smile. "Perhaps it doesn't concern me, but it might not concern you." Albert I nodded, looking at Charles. "Many people want to hear your opinion." "My opinion?" Charles was confused. Why should they hear the opinion of a colonel? Gallier seemed to see through Charles's thoughts. He glanced at Charles with a strange look and said casually, "You seem unaware of your influence, Colonel." Seeing Charles's bewildered expression, Gallier smiled and shook his head slightly. "Do you think that after inventing so much equipment and winning so many battles, people will still treat you like an ordinary person? Perhaps in France, because it is controlled by capitalists, and capitalists control parliament, but in any country other than France, including Britain and Russia, all strategists hope to have your approval when formulating battle plans and making decisions." Albert I nodded in affirmation of Gallier's statement. "They may not say it, but in their hearts they will take your opinion as the standard answer." "Colonel." As he said this, Albert I's eyes gleamed with pride, as if he were honored to be friends with Charles. Charles was somewhat speechless, because this influence seemed to be of little use to him, only bringing him trouble. For example, now Albert I had come to him asking for opinion. Looking into Albert I's expectant eyes, Charles understood that this wasn't simply a matter of seeking opinions. As King of Belgium, Albert I naturally hoped the Allies would land from the north, because a successful landing would mean the restoration of Belgium was not far off. A landing from the south, however, was not the same. Therefore, Albert I hoped to gain Charles's support. And Charles's attitude, as they had just discussed, since Charles was always right and always won, was likely to sway the deadlocked northern and southern factions to one side. Albert I was destined to be disappointed. Historically, this battle was fought in the Dardanelles Strait in the south, and although it ultimately ended in defeat, both sides lost 250,000 men and gained nothing. At this moment, the woman he had met at the ball suddenly flashed through Charles's mind. Naval battle, landing, the Minister of the Navy, his lover. This meant that all the Allied battle plans would be laid bare before the German army, with no secrets whatsoever. Thinking of this, Charles pointed north with an air of importance and said, "I think we should land from the north." "Yes, that's what I think too." Albert's tense expression instantly relaxed, his eyes flashing with excitement. Pointing to the map, he said, "Once our army successfully lands in the north, we can immediately attack the German troops stationed in Belgium from the rear, thereby cutting off their supply lines." Charles nodded with difficulty. "This could determine the outcome of this war. The Germans will have to abandon the entire Western Front." He said this, but in his heart he was thinking, "Your Majesty, Belgium built a Liège fortress. Although part of it has been destroyed, several strong fortifications were left when they surrendered. The Germans are guarding there. What can our landing force attack with?" He thought this but did not show it on his face. Continuing to support Albert I, Gallieni frowned. But this also means we'll be attacked from both sides by the main German forces, from all directions, and even the German fleet. I don't think we need to worry about the German fleet, Charles replied. Britain has always implemented a doubling plan. For every warship the Germans build, they build two. Now is the time for the British fleet to come in handy. I think so too, Albert. I nodded repeatedly. Britain is fully capable of both blockading the German fleet and simultaneously sending some ships to reinforce the landing force, Charles added. There's another advantage to this: both fleets are in the Atlantic, so the landing fleet and the blockade fleet can reinforce each other if necessary. If we land from the south, a very good idea, Albert, I exclaimed excitedly. If we land from the south, the landing fleet will have to enter the Mediterranean, and the two fleets won't be able to reinforce each other, Charles concluded. We must consider this. If the German fleet breaks out during our landing operation, they could catch the British fleet off guard. Unless Britain is confident in blockading the German fleet with an evenly matched fleet, we will have no choice but to land from the north. This analysis left Gallieni speechless, because such a risk did indeed exist. The image above shows the British battleship HMS Ireland, originally named HMS Residich, one of the Ottoman battleships seized by the British. The image above shows the British battleship HMS Agincourt, originally named HMS Ottoman Sultan I, one of the Ottoman battleships seized by the British. Chapter 223. It's time to develop bombers. Albert I left overjoyed. He regarded Charles's opinion as the hope for restoring his kingdom, and his next task was to use it to persuade others, something Albert I excelled at. Charles felt a pang of guilt. Albert I considered him a friend, placing all his hopes on him, yet Charles had used him. After Albert I left, Gallieni asked meaningfully, do you really think we're better suited to land in the north? Gallieni understood Charles. He could read Charles's expression earlier. Charles might have talent in military affairs and equipment, but not in lying. Charles didn't answer but asked, General, which side are you on? Gallieni gently shook his head. They've been working to end the war as quickly as possible, but I think things might not be as optimistic as they think. You said before that the war wouldn't end so soon, and the situation seems to be developing in that direction. Charles nodded slightly. This was the correct idea. Gallieni was somewhat surprised. You mean, landing from either direction is wrong? I had to choose, Charles replied, because if I don't choose, they'll continue arguing, and eventually they'll arrive at what they believe is the right answer and do what they think is right. Gallieni nodded. Not choosing meant giving equal support to both sides. The balance would remain in the middle. So you chose the north, Gallieni said. The north was a more aggressive landing method, leading directly to the powerful German army, likely their elite forces. Charles didn't answer. He said to Gallieni, you should rest, General. He stood up, saluted Gallieni, and turned to leave. Watching Charles quietly close the door, Gallieni felt a pang of doubt. Charles should at least have answered yes, which wouldn't have taken much time, but he hadn't. Then Gallieni realized that Charles had likely chosen the south, not the north. He had deceived Albert I. He didn't answer because he couldn't speak, and at the same time, he didn't want to lie to Gallieni. A slight smile played on Gallieni's lips as he muttered, that little fellow, he shouldn't avoid it. This was military strategy, not one to let emotions cloud judgment. If Charles was setting a trap for the enemy, then so be it, even if the one being deceived was Gallieni. However, deep down, Gallieni agreed more with Charles's current approach. Then Gallieni frowned again. The French commander-in-chief, Joffre, and his deputy, Foch, belonged to a third faction. They scoffed at the British idea of opening a new front at sea, firmly believing that victory on the Western Front was imminent, provided the French army launches a more resolute and comprehensive offensive. This was also why the military planned to order 500 Charles A1 tanks at once. They believed that Charles A1 tanks could also bring victory in their hands. Gallieni felt he should do everything in his power to stop Joffre from pushing soldiers onto the battlefield for pointless sacrifices. The next morning, after getting up, Charles peeked through the curtains to see the scenery outside. The snow was falling heavier and heavier, and the snow had settled down, no longer melting repeatedly like before. Charles actually preferred this kind of weather, at least the ground wouldn't look so wet. But the soldiers freezing on the front lines probably didn't think so. While washing up, Charles looked in the mirror and noticed a pimple on his face, probably from eating too much applesauce. He put on his uniform and left the barracks, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 7:40. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand had gotten up even earlier than Charles. Since Charles's promotion to colonel, The miscellaneous task of sorting intelligence was no longer his responsibility. It had been transferred back to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. Charles's job was to do a final screening of the intelligence, leaving those that didn't need reporting or could be handled independently to Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, and reporting the rest to Galini in order of priority. Nothing special, Colonel. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand handed Charles a stack of intelligence reports. The Cape Town line has stabilized. The Germans seem to have copied our grenades, and also have mortars. Charles took the telegram and grunted in agreement. This was expected. Once something proved useful on the battlefield, the enemy would quickly develop similar equipment. The key point was that they didn't pay royalties. Charles cursed inwardly. They were practically robbers. Charles sat in his chair, flipping through the telegrams. He set aside the important ones, focusing on the less important ones, shuffling them like a deck of cards. He wasn't foolish enough to sort the less important intelligence. Then, a telegram caught Charles's attention. 2 reconnaissance planes in the Somme region were confirmed missing. This was normally a very ordinary piece of intelligence. Missing reconnaissance planes happened almost every few days, but Charles still lingered on it for a moment. Just then, Gallier emerged, dressed in his uniform. Charles immediately approached with a telegram, reporting, "General, 2 reconnaissance planes have gone missing in the Somme region." Gallier grunted in acknowledgement, then asked, "Is there anything unusual?" Before the words were even finished, Gallier understood. He stopped, turned around, and took the telegram from Charles, asking, "You mean, this was the enemy's doing?" Charles nodded. 2 reconnaissance planes disappeared in the same area. Although they were carefully separated, the disappearances were very concentrated. "I suspect the Germans are testing or practicing," Gallier grunted gravely. If the Germans had acquired the machine gun firing coordinator, they wouldn't be foolish enough to engage the 1st French Flying Squadron in a life-or-death battle right away. After all, the pilots of the 1st French Flying Squadron had accumulated considerable combat experience, and although it wasn't a direct aircraft-to-air engagement, they still held the advantage. If the Germans launched a rash attack, they could very well wipe out all of their elite pilots in the first wave. The best option was to train them for a period of time first, or send them into the air to secretly hunt down enemy reconnaissance planes, so they could get used to the rhythm of the machine guns before competing for air superiority with the French 1st Flying Group. Gallier walked back to his chair, his steps heavy. He sat down slowly, his face expressionless, and said, "At least one thing is certain, the Germans already know the secret of the machine gun firing coordinator. What do you plan to do?" Charles considered for a moment and replied, "Standardize the aircraft type. Equip all planes with machine guns, and convert all pilots to fighter pilots." Gallier nodded in agreement. Now that the secret had been leaked, there was no need for secrecy. Machine gun aircraft should be deployed comprehensively, and the number and scope of pilots should be expanded. However, Charles was thinking about another issue. It was time to develop bombers. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 224 Torpedo Bomber. Carter's Flying Club needs no special mention, but Charles ordered them to be on high alert and to convert all pilots to fighter pilot training. Galini, meanwhile, was recruiting pilots en masse from the general public and simultaneously setting up a dedicated flying academy to recruit young people interested in joining the Air Force. Only in this way could the supply of pilots for future operations be guaranteed. Charles immediately went to the aircraft manufacturing plant to find Eric. Eric invited Charles to sit down in the plant's lounge and made them both a hot cup of coffee. After hearing Charles's description, Eric exclaimed, "God, we should develop a single-seat aircraft in the shortest possible time." The Avro had good performance, but it was a 2-seat aircraft, and the extra seat was completely unnecessary for a fighter jet. But Charles thought there was no rush. "The Germans don't have dedicated single-seat fighters either," Charles replied. "While it needs to be done, it can be postponed." "Postponed?" Eric asked Charles doubtfully. "But besides that, we don't seem to have anything else to do." Charles smiled without answering, then countered, "How is the engine development going?" Eric nodded eagerly. "They're fantastic, Colonel." "You're right, you've signed a bunch of crazy people, especially that Dorn, the one who speaks French," Charles asked. Charles remembered Dorn. He was one of the few who wanted to bring his family to Paris for the long term. Charles had jokingly asked him why, and he replied, "I think differently from the others. I don't think Paris is in danger. The Germans have lost their chance to occupy Paris, so there's nothing to worry about." Charles didn't know whether to praise him. From the perspective of World War I, he was quite far-sighted. The Germans indeed couldn't occupy Paris. But World War II? Yes, it's him. Eric warmed his hands with his coffee cup. He was chosen by the R&D team to lead the project. Shouldn't he be the head of the R&D department? Charles asked, puzzled. They like to call him that, Eric replied with a smile. They're very casual. They just call me boss, whenever there's a problem. They call me old man and me, Charles asked, somewhat curious. They call you boss, but many more call you Corsican boy. Eric chuckled as he said this. Charles was taken aback. He didn't understand what Corsican boy meant. Then he realized it was a slightly derogatory nickname the British gave Napoleon. Not a bad nickname, Charles smiled slightly. Perhaps this was British humor. They've only been here a few weeks, and they've already increased the engine's horsepower to over 100, Eric exclaimed. That's a huge improvement, and it's still going strong, Charles nodded in satisfaction. A 100 horsepower engine would meet their current needs. Charles didn't say much, took out a blueprint from his briefcase and handed it to Eric. Next, we should produce this kind of aircraft. Eric took the blueprint and looked at it, then looked at Charles in surprise. This is a big machine, Colonel, Charles grunted in acknowledgement. Eric continued flipping through the blueprint, then looked up at Charles again. It has 3 engines. Yes, Charles answered, holding his coffee, one on each wing, and one more at the rear. The only difference is that the rear one is a propulsion engine. Taking a small sip, Charles asked, are there any difficulties? No. Of course not, Eric waved the blueprint and replied, the R&D department can provide the engines, you provide the blueprints, all we have to do is produce it according to the blueprints, that's what we're good at. But, Eric frowned. But what? Charles asked. This might be outside my duties, Colonel, Eric said with some concern. But if you need an aircraft for aerial combat, it shouldn't be this big. You also need to consider its maneuverability. A behemoth like this, it might not be able to turn in time and therefore wouldn't be able to dodge enemy fire. I know, Charles interrupted Eric. So it's not for combat, it's for bombing. Charles leaned closer and pointed to a spot on the drawing. This is a bomb rack, Eric said. Oh, and then added, understood, Colonel. Drop bombs on the enemy's heads. Good idea. Eric didn't ask anything further, because it involved military secrets, and Eric knew what he should and shouldn't ask. Actually, there was nothing to hide from Eric about military secrets. The drawing was the most important military secret. Charles didn't say much because Eric might not understand some of the military aspects. The drawing Charles gave Eric was of the famous Capronica 3 bomber from World War I, an Italian-made aircraft. Charles chose this bomber because it allowed for a significant increase in engine capacity. In the early stages of World War I, aircraft engines generally had a horsepower of around 80 to 100, making it difficult for bombers to carry heavy bombs. The Caproni bomber, however, was different. It had an additional engine added to the rear of the fuselage, enabling it to carry 800 kilograms of bombs. Later, when the engine was upgraded to 150 horsepower, replacing it with a higher-powered engine was no problem. More importantly, the Caproni bomber could carry torpedoes. Towards the end of World War I, the Navy converted it into a torpedo bomber and successfully equipped a torpedo bomber squadron. Unfortunately, it didn't play a significant role as World War I ended, resulting in no combat records. This bomber perfectly met Charles's needs. The only problem was that Charles only remembered the general shape and layout and couldn't provide detailed data. However, this could be addressed through flight testing. Charles instructed, this is just a preliminary design, you'll need to find someone to further refine it. Understood, Colonel. Eric, flipping through the blueprints, answered confidently without looking up. Leave it to me. Eric was very knowledgeable about aircraft. He was an expert in aircraft manufacturing. He could see that the blueprints had already determined the general direction, only some details needed modification and refinement. Sitting in the car returning to headquarters after leaving the aircraft factory, Charles thought that the next step was to get Steed to produce the aerial bombs. This wouldn't be difficult for Steed, enlarged mortar shells would suffice. Then, before the Germans were prepared, they could bomb their airfields. The German Air Force elites were concentrated there, along with a large number of fighter planes newly equipped with machine guns. Dropping a batch of bombs would render all their recent efforts futile. The image above shows a Caproni bomber. You can see the propeller at the rear of the fuselage, with a rear gunner directly above it. There is another gunner at the nose, plus 2 pilots. For a total of 4 crew members. The image above shows a naval version of the Caproni bomber from World War I, which could carry an 800-kilogram torpedo. Chapter 225 The Arrogant Englishman. Charles woke up to find himself on vacation again. However, before he could even get out of bed, there was a knock at his dormitory door. Thinking it was some urgent military matter at headquarters, Charles quickly crawled out of his warm bed, threw on his infantry overcoat, and slipped on his slippers to open the door. He was taken aback by the person standing there, General Winter. "Hello, Colonel." General Winter smiled and shook hands with Charles, his hand as cold as ice. Seeing General Winter's tired expression, Charles stepped aside to let him in and asked curiously, "General, did you come to Paris specifically for this?" "Just arrived, yes," General Winter yawned, glancing around Charles's dormitory as he answered, "I came specifically to see you, Colonel." Charles, who was putting on his uniform, paused for a moment, then understood. It must be about the north-south landings. His purpose here was likely the opposite of Albert I's, and he hoped Charles would change his tune. Charles shivered from the cold, and without thinking, quickly put on his uniform and then his infantry overcoat. It seemed that the overcoat was the only thing in the uniform that provided warmth. The orderly, Adrian, thoughtfully brought them both hot coffee, and took the opportunity to ask Charles, "Would you like breakfast brought over, Colonel?" Charles turned to General Winter, who held up his coffee and replied, "Thank you very much, I already ate on the way, this is enough." Charles believed this. This was the advantage of Western food. Bread could be eaten anytime, anywhere, even while walking. Adrian understood and closed the door behind him as he left. "So," Charles asked preemptively, "did Albert I's words work?" Winter's expression was somewhat strange. "It must have been your words that worked, Colonel. Originally, they preferred to land in the south, but because of your analysis and Albert I's lobbying, they are now seriously considering landing in the north, because it's very tempting." Charles squeezed his boots on, stomped his feet to make them more comfortable. "If we could land in the Netherlands, that would be even better, both safe and fast, putting the German forces in Belgium in a pincer movement, but the Netherlands is a neutral country." General Winter interrupted Charles. "Doing so could push the Netherlands towards the Allies." "You've done that before," Charles said sarcastically, taking a sip of his coffee and finding it a little cold. General Winter knew that Charles was referring to the Ottoman Empire and replied helplessly, "Well, it is indeed our fault. We didn't expect things to develop to this point." "You should have thought of that," Charles said mercilessly. "Those 2 warships are nothing more than 2 insignificant additions to your existing fleet of dozens of battleships. But for the Ottoman Empire, it was funds raised through a nationwide fundraising effort. If you had investigated these matters before seizing them, you would have known how much public outrage this banditry would provoke, and how that outrage would force the government to implement a series of policies and propaganda detrimental to the Allied powers." General Winter was filled with shame. Charles was right. The Minister of the Navy was indeed completely unaware when he decided to seize the warships. He simply said, "War is coming, we need these warships," and then he seized them, without mentioning any breach of contract, payment, or reparations. "The First Lord of the Admiralty believes we can achieve victory at minimal cost." General Winter shifted the focus to the main point. "He is the representative for the Southern Offensive." Charles sat quietly in his chair, watching General Winter. If he knew the extent of Britain's losses from detaining those 2 battleships, they might have imprisoned the First Lord of the Admiralty immediately. Detaining the 2 battleships led to the Ottoman Empire joining the Central Powers from neutrality. With the Ottoman Empire joining the Central Powers, the sea route from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and then to Russia was blocked. Russia ultimately lost the Eastern Front due to insufficient supplies. In other words, the impact of Britain detaining the 2 warships was not only the 250,000 deaths in the Dardanelles War and the 6 battleships sunk by mines and coastal artillery, and the defection of several neutral countries, including the Ottoman Empire, to the enemy. Most seriously, it was the loss of the entire Eastern Front. If it weren't for the United States' involvement, the Allies might have lost the war. The First Lord of the Admiralty, who almost single-handedly brought down World War I, was now vehemently advocating for operations in the Dardanelles in the south. General Winter stood before Charles's desk, pointing to the Dardanelles straight on the map. The First Lord of the Admiralty believes that once our fleet passes through here into the Sea of Marmara, we can position our cannons beneath Constantinople, at which point the Ottoman Empire will surrender. Therefore, the situation you described won't occur. Charles looked at General Winter, his eyes filled with disbelief. You mean, you can make the Ottoman Empire surrender with just a few naval ships? General Winter shrugged and countered, is there a problem? Charles scoffed dismissively. He understood the First Lord of the Admiralty's motives for detaining the two warships. The First Lord of the Admiralty thought those two warships were more important than the Ottoman Empire, that they were enough to force its surrender. After weighing the pros and cons, of course, he wanted the warships, not the Ottoman Empire. Arrogant, foolish, and prejudiced Englishman. Please leave, General. Charles dismissed him. There was no point in continuing the discussion. The enemy was nothing more than an ant they could easily crush. There were no difficulties or dangers. The strategic locations on the map were simply waiting for their warships to seize them. No, Colonel, General Winter said, I'd like to hear your opinion. I stand by my point, Charles said firmly. A landing in the north is clearly more suitable. Charles had originally intended to use the north as a pretext for the Germans, but now he felt that a northern landing might not be a bad thing. At least, a northern landing would draw the British's attention, and they would know they were facing a powerful adversary, Germany. General Winter was silent for a moment, then looked at Charles and said, You don't support opening a new front, do you? You don't support landings from either side, that's why you mentioned the north. You're trying to prevent a landing operation. Charles didn't deny it, he did indeed have such thoughts. But they will ultimately choose to land on one side, General Winter said somewhat helplessly. That's just how Britain is. Britain was a maritime power. Their offensive tactics were always a combination of land and sea, just as the French always emphasized offensive tactics. This was combat experience ingrained in their minds for centuries. They wouldn't give up without trying. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.